Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Sheriff Clayton Matthews had been running Brewster County for 12 years, and in all that time, he'd never received a letter quite like this one. It arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, mixed in with the usual stack of court summons and county business correspondence. No return address, no postmark that made any sense, just a faded stamp and his name written in block letters that looked like they'd been traced with a ruler. The envelope was thick, expensive paper. Not the kind of thing you'd buy at the local Dollar General. Clayton turned it over in his weathered hands, noting the weight of it, the careful way it had been sealed. 23 years in law enforcement had taught him to pay attention to details like that. Details could save your life or cost you everything. Inside was a single sheet of the same heavy paper, and the message was brief. Sheriff Matthews. There are things happening at the old Morrison Ranch that you need to see. They've been there for 6 months now. Check the back buildings after dark. Don't bring backup. They're watching everything. A concerned citizen. Clayton read it twice, then set it down on his desk next to his morning coffee. The Morrison Ranch. He knew the place, though it had been empty for the better part of 3 years. Old Billy Morrison had died of lung cancer back in 2018, and his kids lived up in Dallas now. They'd tried to sell the property, but 1,700 acres of high desert scrubland wasn't exactly in high demand. The last he'd heard, they were still paying property taxes and hoping someone would eventually make an offer. The ranch sat about 35 miles northeast of Alpine, accessible only by a dirt road that branched off Highway 118. It was remote even by West Texas standards, the kind of place where you could fire a rifle and not worry about hitting anything but jackrabbits and coyotes. If someone wanted to set up some kind of operation where they wouldn't be bothered, the Morrison Ranch would be perfect. Clayton picked up his phone and dialed the county assessor's office. "Morning, Janet. I need you to check something for me. The Morrison Ranch out on Terlingua Creek Road. Has there been any change in ownership recently? Any permits filed? Any utilities turned on?" Janet Coleman had been working in the assessor's office since before Clayton was born. If there was paperwork filed anywhere in Brewster County, she'd know about it. "Hold on, let me check the computer." He could hear her typing. The sound of someone who'd learned to use computers late in life but had mastered them through sheer determination. No changes in ownership. Still belongs to the Morrison heirs. No permits filed in the past year. But Clayton? Yeah? There is something odd. Someone's been paying the utility bills, electric and water both. Started back in May, payments coming from some kind of trust company out of Houston. Clayton felt that familiar tingle at the base of his skull, the one he'd learned to trust over the years. Something wasn't right. "You got a name on that trust company?" "Lone Star Property Management. I can fax you the details if you want." "Do that. And Janet, keep this between us for now." Clayton hung up and stared at the anonymous letter again. 6 months, the writer had said. The utilities had been turned on in May. Someone had definitely taken up residence at the Morrison Ranch, and they were being careful about it. Careful enough to use a Houston management company to pay the bills. Careful enough to stay off the radar of local law enforcement. But not careful enough to avoid the attention of whoever had written this letter. The question was, what were they doing out there that required this level of secrecy? In Clayton's experience, People who went to great lengths to avoid law enforcement usually had good reasons. Drug manufacturing was the obvious guess. The Morrison Ranch would be perfect for a methamphetamine operation. Remote, defensible, with access to water and electricity. But meth cookers were usually small-time operations, 2 or 3 people at most. This felt bigger, more organized. Clayton spent the rest of the morning trying to focus on routine sheriff's department business, but his mind kept drifting back to the letter. The handwriting bothered him. Too neat, too careful, like someone had practiced writing those words before committing them to paper. And the warning about being watched, that suggested these people, whoever they were, had surveillance capabilities. Motion detectors, maybe, or security cameras. Around noon, he decided to take a drive. Not to the Morrison Ranch, not yet, but to some of the neighboring properties. If something was happening out there, maybe the neighbors had noticed. The closest neighbor was a man named Rex Carver, who ran cattle on a spread about 10 miles south of the Morrison place. Clayton had known Rex for years. He was one of those hard-bitten ranchers who'd been born on his land and would probably die there. He had strong opinions about everything and wasn't shy about sharing them. Clayton found Rex mending fence near his southern pasture, working alone in the afternoon heat. Rex was 72 years old, but still did most of his ranch work himself. He looked up when Clayton's patrol car pulled up, squinting against the sun. "Clayton, what brings you out to my little corner of paradise?" "Just checking on folks, Rex. Haven't seen you in town lately." "Town's gotten too crowded for my taste. Too many tourists coming through, taking pictures of everything like they've never seen a cow before." Rex straightened up, stretching his back. "You want some coffee? Norma made a fresh pot this morning." "That'd be good. Actually, Rex, I wanted to ask you something. You been noticing anything unusual lately? Any activity around the Morrison place?" Rex's expression changed. The easy smile disappeared, replaced by something more guarded. "Why do you ask?" "Just following up on some information I received." "Have you seen anything?" Rex set down his fence pliers and looked toward the north, in the direction of the Morrison Ranch. "Matter of fact, I have. Been meaning to call you about it, but you know how it is. Always something that needs doing around here." "What kind of activity?" "Vehicles, mostly. Big trucks coming and going at night. And I mean big. 18-wheelers, construction equipment, that sort of thing. Been going on for months now." Clayton felt his pulse quicken. How many months? Started back in the spring. Maybe April or May. At first I figured maybe the Morrison kids had finally sold the place. Someone was getting ready to build on it. But then I realized I never saw any for sale signs come down. Never heard anything through the grapevine. You get a look at any of these trucks? License plates, company names? Too far away, and they usually come through around midnight, 1 or 2 in the morning. But Clayton, there's something else. Something that's been bothering me more than the trucks." "What's that?" Rex glanced around, as if making sure they weren't being overheard. "The people. I've seen people walking around out there, but they don't act like construction workers or ranch hands. They move different. Like soldiers, you know? Real disciplined-like. And they all wear the same kind of clothes, dark colors, military style. How many people? Hard to say. I've seen maybe 8 or 10 at a time, but that doesn't mean there aren't more. And Clayton, they've got dogs, big ones. German shepherds maybe, or Belgian Malinois. Professional guard dogs, not pets." Clayton made mental notes. Professional security, guard dogs, nighttime deliveries of heavy equipment. This was starting to sound less like a meth lab and more like something else entirely. "Rex, have you told anyone else about this?" "Just Norma. She thinks I should mind my own business, but It's hard to ignore when you're lying in bed at night and you can hear diesel engines grinding up that hill. I'd appreciate it if you kept this between us for now. I'm going to look into it, but I don't want to spook these people before I know what we're dealing with. Rex nodded. You be careful out there, Clayton. I've been ranching this country for 50 years, and I know when something doesn't smell right. Whatever those people are doing, it ain't legal. Clayton thanked Rex for the coffee and drove back toward town, his mind racing. The anonymous letter was starting to make more sense. Someone, possibly someone involved with whatever was happening at the Morrison Ranch, was having second thoughts. Maybe a crisis of conscience, or maybe a falling out with the other participants. Either way, they were trying to get law enforcement involved without directly implicating themselves. The warning about being watched was particularly troubling. If these people had surveillance equipment monitoring the approaches to the ranch, they'd know if law enforcement was coming. That suggested a level of sophistication and planning that went far beyond typical criminal activity. Back at the sheriff's office, Clayton pulled out a map of Brewster County and studied the area around the Morrison Ranch. The property was shaped roughly like a boot, with the main house and outbuildings clustered in the heel area near Terlingua Creek. The toe extended northward for about 2 miles, mostly empty grazing land dotted with mesquite and prickly pear. If someone wanted to hide activity from the main road, the back buildings near the creek would be the logical place. The anonymous letter had specifically mentioned checking the back buildings after dark. That suggested whatever was happening there was more active at night, which matched what Rex had told him about the nighttime truck traffic. Clayton looked at his watch. 4:30 in the afternoon. If he was going to follow the letter writer's advice about checking after dark, he had a few hours to prepare. The smart thing would be to call the Texas Rangers, maybe the FBI, get some backup with serious firepower. But the letter had specifically warned against bringing backup, claiming they're watching everything. If that was true, if these people really did have surveillance capabilities, then bringing in outside help might just tip them off and cause them to disappear before he could figure out what they were up to. On the other hand, going in alone could be walking into a trap. Clayton had been making these kinds of decisions for 12 years, weighing risk against potential reward, trying to balance officer safety with the need to gather intelligence. Most of the time, the cautious approach was the right approach. But sometimes, if you waited too long for backup or tried to build an airtight case before acting, the bad guys had time to cover their tracks. He decided on a compromise. He'd go out to the Morrison Ranch alone, but he'd do it smart. Night vision equipment, backup radio, GPS tracker so dispatch would know his location. He'd observe and report, gather intelligence without confronting anyone directly. If what he found warranted it, then he'd call for backup. Clayton spent the next hour going through equipment, checking batteries, making sure his gear was in working order. He updated his will, something he'd gotten in the habit of doing before any potentially dangerous operation. He left a sealed envelope in his desk drawer with instructions for Deputy Angela Rodriguez to open if he didn't check in by sunrise. As the sun set over the Chisos Mountains, painting the West Texas sky in shades of orange and purple, Clayton loaded his gear into his personal truck rather than the patrol car. If these people were watching for law enforcement, a civilian vehicle might attract less attention. The drive to the Morrison Ranch took 45 minutes, following Highway 118 north through increasingly desolate country. Clayton had grown up in this part of Texas, and he never got tired of the vast emptiness of it. The way the landscape seemed to stretch on forever, broken only by the occasional windmill or stock tank. It was beautiful country, but unforgiving, the kind of place where you could disappear and never be found. As he turned off the highway onto Terlingua Creek Road, Clayton switched off his headlights and continued by moonlight. The road was rough, full of potholes and washouts, but he knew it well enough to navigate carefully in the dark. He parked about a mile from the main gate, pulling his truck behind a stand of ocotillo where it wouldn't be visible from the road. From there, he continued on foot, moving slowly and carefully through the brush. The night was clear and cold, typical for October in the high desert. Clayton wore dark clothing and a tactical vest, carrying night vision equipment and his service weapon. Every few hundred yards he stopped to listen and observe, making sure he wasn't being followed or watched. The Morrison Ranch's main gate came into view around 10 o'clock. It was a simple ranch gate, steel posts and barbed wire, but Clayton could see it had been upgraded recently. New locks, reinforced hinges, and something that looked like a small security camera mounted on one of the posts. The dirt road beyond the gate disappeared into darkness, winding through low hills toward the main ranch buildings. Clayton skirted the gate, following the property line east toward Terlingua Creek. According to his map, the back buildings were about 2 miles from the main entrance, accessible by an old ranch road that followed the creek bed. If he was careful and stayed in the brush, he could approach from the east without using any of the main roads. The hike took nearly an hour, moving slowly through terrain that seemed designed to trip you up. Thorny bushes grabbed at his clothing, loose rocks shifted underfoot, and twice he had to detour around deep arroyos that weren't marked on any map. But finally, he reached a low ridge that overlooked the back section of the Morrison Ranch. What he saw through his night vision scope made his blood run cold. The area around the old ranch buildings had been completely transformed. New construction everywhere, barracks-style buildings, a vehicle maintenance bay, what looked like a communications tower. The whole compound was lit by portable floodlights powered by a generator that hummed in the darkness. And there were people. Lots of people. Clayton counted at least 20 men, all dressed in military-style clothing, all carrying assault rifles. They moved with precision and purpose, like soldiers on patrol. Guard dogs roamed the perimeter. German shepherds, just like Rex had described. But it was the vehicles that really caught his attention. Military vehicles, Humvees, troop transports, even what looked like an armored personnel carrier. All painted in desert camouflage, all bearing no visible identification. This wasn't a drug operation or some kind of survivalist compound. This was a military installation, hidden on private property in the middle of nowhere, operating without any apparent government oversight. Clayton watched for 2 hours, documenting everything he could see, taking photographs with a telephoto lens. The more he observed, the more questions arose. Who were these people? What were they training for? And why were they doing it in secret on private land in Texas? Around midnight, activity in the compound began to increase. More lights came on, and Clayton could hear the sound of engines starting up. Through his scope, he watched as the men began loading equipment into vehicles, breaking down temporary structures, preparing to move. Someone had tipped them off. Despite his precautions, despite avoiding the main roads and staying hidden in the brush, somehow they knew law enforcement was watching. Clayton was debating whether to try to get closer for better photographs when he heard the sound that made his decision for him. The low growl of a dog, very close behind him. He turned slowly to find himself facing 3 German shepherds, all focused intently on him, all waiting for a command from their handlers. Behind the dogs, barely visible in the darkness, were 2 men in military fatigues carrying automatic weapons. "Sheriff Matthews," one of them said, his voice calm and professional. "We need to talk." They didn't handcuff him, which Clayton took as either a good sign or a very bad one. The two men in military fatigues escorted him down the ridge and through the compound with professional courtesy, their weapons lowered but ready. The dogs trotted alongside, alert but no longer aggressive. "Don't try anything stupid, Sheriff," the taller of the two men said. He had the bearing of someone used to command, probably former military himself. "We're not looking for trouble, but we're prepared for it." Clayton kept his hands visible and his mouth shut as they walked through the compound. Up close, the operation was even more impressive and disturbing than it had appeared through his night vision scope. This wasn't some hastily assembled militia camp. It was a sophisticated military installation with professional-grade equipment and obvious attention to operational security. The temporary buildings were actually high-quality modular structures, the kind used by military contractors in overseas deployments. The vehicles weren't surplus military hardware bought at auction. They were current-generation equipment, well-maintained and properly armed. The communications tower, he'd observed, was part of a satellite uplink system that probably cost more than his sheriff's department's entire annual budget. They led him to what appeared to be a command center, a larger modular building with multiple antennae and a backup generator. Inside, the walls were covered with maps, satellite photographs, and what looked like surveillance reports. A dozen computer workstations hummed quietly, displaying information that Clayton couldn't read from his angle. "Have a seat, Sheriff." The tall man gestured to a folding chair positioned in front of a metal desk. "Can I get you some coffee? Water?" "Coffee would be good," Clayton said, trying to project calm authority despite being seriously outgunned and outnumbered. "And I'd like to know who I'm talking to." "Fair enough." The man poured coffee from a thermos into a metal cup and handed it to Clayton. "Colonel Wade Brennan, United States Army, retired. My associate here is Major Dwayne Foster, also retired. And you, of course, are Sheriff Clayton Matthews, Brewster County, Texas. 12 years in office, previously a deputy for 8 years, served in the Gulf War with the 82nd Airborne. Married to Sarah for 19 years, 2 daughters in college. Clayton kept his expression neutral, but internally he was calculating. These men had done their homework on him, which meant they'd been watching him specifically, not just monitoring general law enforcement activity in the area. That level of intelligence gathering suggested resources and connections that went far beyond what any criminal organization could muster. Impressive research, Colonel. But you missed one important detail. What's that? I left a sealed envelope in my desk with instructions for my deputy to open if I don't check in by sunrise. That envelope contains everything I observed here tonight, plus some specific recommendations about who to call if something happens to me. Colonel Brennan smiled, but it was a cold expression. We know about the envelope, Sheriff. We also know you used your personal vehicle instead of your patrol car, that you approached from the east to avoid our perimeter sensors, and that you've been asking questions about truck traffic in the area. So you were watching me. We've been watching everyone, Sheriff. It's what we do. Brennan pulled up a chair and sat down across from Clayton. The question is, what do we do about you now? Clayton sipped his coffee, buying time to think. The fact that they were talking instead of just shooting him suggested they had options other than murder. But what those options were, and whether any of them involved him walking out of here alive, remained to be seen. Why don't you start by telling me what this operation is about? What are you training for? That's classified information. Not anymore, it isn't. The moment you set up a military installation on private property without government authorization, you made it a law enforcement matter. Brennan exchanged a look with Major Foster, and Clayton could see them having some kind of silent communication. Finally, Brennan turned back to him. "Sheriff, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound crazy, but I need you to listen carefully because the security of this country depends on people like us being prepared for what's coming." "I'm listening." "The United States government is no longer capable of protecting its own citizens. Our military is stretched thin across the globe, our intelligence agencies are compromised by political agendas, and our civilian leadership is more concerned with polls than with national security." Brennan's voice carried the conviction of someone who truly believed what he was saying. "There are threats gathering, Sheriff. Threats that our government either can't or won't address." "What kind of threats?" "Terrorist sleeper cells, foreign military units operating on American soil, criminal cartels with capabilities that rival those of nation-states, and worse, domestic enemies who want to destroy the Constitution and everything this country stands for." Clayton had heard variations of this speech before, usually from militia groups and conspiracy theorists. But coming from someone with Colonel Brennan's apparent resources and professional competence, it carried more weight. "So, you're taking matters into your own hands? We're preparing to defend the homeland when the government fails to do so. Training qualified personnel to respond to threats that conventional law enforcement can't handle. Building the capability to protect American citizens when nobody else will. With whose authority? The same authority that drove the founding fathers to take up arms against tyranny. The natural right of free men to defend themselves and their communities." Clayton set down his coffee cup. "Colonel, with all due respect, what you're describing sounds like treason." "What we're describing, Sheriff, is patriotism. True patriotism, not the flag-waving, anthem-singing kind, but the kind that requires sacrifice and commitment and the willingness to do what needs to be done." Major Foster spoke up for the first time. "Sheriff, we know your background. Military service, law enforcement career, strong community ties. You understand the concept of duty, of protecting people who can't protect themselves. I also understand the concept of working within the system, not around it." "The system is broken," Brennan said flatly. "How many criminals have you arrested who were back on the street within hours? How many drug dealers, violent criminals, predators who prey on children? How many times have you done everything right, followed every rule, dotted every I, and crossed every T, only to watch the courts turn them loose?" It was a fair point, and one that hit close to home. Clayton had indeed spent 12 years watching guilty people escape consequences due to technicalities, overcrowded prisons, and liberal judges. The frustration was real, and it was shared by most of the law enforcement officers he knew. That doesn't justify taking the law into your own hands. We're not taking the law into our own hands, Sheriff. We're preparing to defend the law when the legal system collapses. Brennan stood up and walked to one of the maps on the wall. "Look at this." The map showed the southwestern United States, with various locations marked in red. These are confirmed cartel operating bases on American soil, not drug distribution points, but actual military installations run by foreign criminal organizations. They have better equipment than most police departments, better training than most National Guard units, and more firepower than anything short of regular army. He pointed to another map. These are Islamic terrorist cells that we know about, the ones that our intelligence agencies have identified but can't or won't move against due to political considerations or jurisdictional disputes. Clayton studied the maps. If the intelligence was accurate, the scope of the threat was indeed larger than anything local law enforcement could handle. But that didn't necessarily validate the solution these men were proposing. Even if all of this is true, Colonel, you're still operating outside the law. You're not authorized to conduct military operations on American soil. You don't have the legal authority to engage these threats." "Legal authority?" Brennan's voice hardened. "Sheriff, legal authority comes from the people, not from politicians in Washington. And when those politicians fail to protect the people, the authority reverts back to the people themselves. That's not how the Constitution works. The Constitution works exactly that way. The right to keep and bear arms, the right to form militias, the right of citizens to defend themselves and their communities. These aren't privileges granted by government. They're natural rights that government is supposed to protect." Clayton was beginning to understand the philosophical framework these men were operating under. They genuinely believed they were patriots defending the Constitution against enemies both foreign and domestic. The fact that they were breaking numerous federal laws in the process was, in their view, irrelevant compared to the greater good they were serving. It was a dangerous mindset, but not necessarily an insane one. Throughout American history, there had been times when citizens had taken up arms to defend their communities when government protection was inadequate or absent. The difference was that this group was preparing for threats that hadn't yet materialized, based on intelligence that couldn't be independently verified. "Sheriff," Major Foster said, "we'd like to offer you an opportunity." "What kind of opportunity?" "Join us. Use your law enforcement experience and your knowledge of local conditions to help us protect this area. We're not asking you to quit your job or abandon your oath of office. We're asking you to expand your concept of that oath." Clayton looked around the command center, taking in the sophisticated equipment, the professional demeanor of the personnel, the obvious investment of time and resources. How many people are involved in this operation? "That's operational security information," Brennan said. "But I can tell you that we have cells in 12 states, with more being established. We have former military personnel, law enforcement officers, intelligence professionals, even some current government employees who share our concerns." Current government employees? People who see the threats from the inside, who know how inadequate the official response is going to be. People who are willing to provide intelligence and resources to those who are actually prepared to act. This was worse than Clayton had initially thought. If Brennan was telling the truth, this wasn't just a rogue military unit. It was a shadow organization with connections throughout the government and military establishment. The kind of organization that could operate undetected for years, recruiting personnel and accumulating resources while planning for some kind of eventual confrontation. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "For now, nothing more than what you're already doing. Be the sheriff of Brewster County, protect your community. But when the time comes, and it will come, we'll need local law enforcement cooperation to respond effectively to the threats we're tracking." "And if I refuse?" Brennan and Foster exchanged another look. "Sheriff, we hope that won't be necessary. We've been watching you for months, and everything we've seen suggests that you're the kind of man who puts the safety of his community above political considerations. That's not an answer. The answer, Sheriff, is that we're offering you a chance to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. A chance to actually make a difference when the system fails." Clayton finished his coffee and set the cup on the desk. "I need time to think about this." "Of course. But understand that time is a luxury we may not have much longer. The threats we're tracking are accelerating. We estimate 18 months, maybe 2 years, before some kind of major incident forces the issue." "What kind of incident?" "Terrorist attack, cartel incursion, economic collapse, foreign military intervention, take your pick. When it happens, the government response will be too little, too late. Local law enforcement will be overwhelmed. That's when communities will need people like us to step in and do what needs to be done." They walked him back through the compound. past soldiers who nodded respectfully, but kept their weapons ready. Clayton could see that the breakdown he'd observed earlier was continuing. Equipment being loaded, structures being disassembled. By morning, there would be little evidence that a major military installation had ever existed on the Morrison Ranch. "One more thing, Sheriff," Brennan said as they reached the perimeter of the compound. "The person who wrote you that anonymous letter. They're one of ours. Someone who thought you should be brought into the fold gradually rather than all at once. We decided direct contact was better." Clayton wasn't surprised. The timing had been too convenient. The intelligence too specific for a random concerned citizen. "Who was it?" "Someone you trust. Someone who knows you well enough to believe you'll do the right thing when the time comes." They gave him back his equipment and escorted him partway back to his truck, the dogs ranging ahead to make sure the path was clear. At the property line, they shook hands like old friends parting after a social visit. "Think about what we discussed, Sheriff," Brennan said. "And remember, we're the good guys. We're trying to save this country, not destroy it." Clayton drove back to Alpine in silence, his mind racing. He'd stumbled into something far bigger and more complex than a simple criminal investigation. A shadow military organization with sophisticated capabilities, government connections, and a mission that sounded patriotic but might actually be treasonous. When he reached his office just before dawn, Clayton went straight to his desk and opened the bottom drawer. The sealed envelope he'd left there was gone. In its place was a single sheet of paper with a brief message written in the same block letters as the anonymous tip. "Sheriff, we told you we were watching. Your deputy is safe, but she's working with us now. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. We'll be in touch soon." Clayton sank into his chair and stared at the message. Angela Rodriguez had been his most trusted deputy for 8 years. If they'd gotten to her, if she was part of this conspiracy, then his entire department might be compromised. He was alone, surrounded by people he could no longer trust, facing an enemy that seemed to anticipate his every move. And somewhere out there, Colonel Brennan and his organization were preparing for a war that might be coming whether anyone wanted it or not. The phone rang, shattering the morning quiet. Clayton stared at it for 3 rings before picking up. Brewster County Sheriff's Department. "Sheriff Matthews? This is Agent Marcus Sullivan, FBI. We need to talk." Agent Marcus Sullivan looked exactly like what Clayton expected from a federal investigator. Pressed suit, polished shoes, and the kind of confidence that came from having the full authority of the United States government backing every word he spoke. But there was something in his eyes that suggested this wasn't going to be a routine federal takeover of a local investigation. "Sheriff Matthews, I appreciate you agreeing to meet on such short notice." Sullivan settled into the chair across from Clayton's desk, placing a briefcase on the floor beside him. "I understand you had an interesting night. Word travels fast in federal circles, faster than you might think. Colonel Wade Brennan and his organization have been on our radar for quite some time. What happened at the Morrison Ranch last night was exactly what we've been waiting for." Clayton poured himself another cup of coffee, his 4th since returning from the compound. Waiting for how? For them to make contact with local law enforcement, to reveal the scope of their operation and their recruitment capabilities. Sullivan opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Sheriff, what I'm about to tell you is classified information. The existence of this conversation, the details of this operation, everything we discuss here cannot be shared with anyone without my explicit authorization. I'm listening. The Constitutional Defense Network, that's what they call themselves, is the largest domestic terrorist organization currently operating on American soil. They have cells in 17 states, over 3,000 active members, and access to military-grade weapons and equipment that shouldn't exist outside official government channels. Sullivan opened the folder and spread several photographs across Clayton's desk. These were taken at training facilities in Montana, Arizona, and Georgia over the past 18 months. Notice the consistency in equipment, training methods, and organizational structure. This isn't a loose affiliation of militia groups. It's a coordinated military operation. The photographs showed compounds similar to what Clayton had observed at the Morrison Ranch. Professional facilities, sophisticated equipment, personnel who moved and acted like trained soldiers rather than weekend warriors playing at being military. What's their objective? They believe the federal government has become illegitimate, that local law enforcement and community leaders need to be prepared to take over when the system collapses. They're preparing for what they call liberation operations, armed interventions to protect communities from threats they believe the government can't or won't address. What kind of threats? Terrorist attacks, cartel incursions, foreign invasion, economic collapse. Take your pick. The specifics vary depending on the local situation, but the underlying philosophy is always the same. Federal authority is failing. Local authority needs to be ready to step in. Clayton studied the photographs, noting the professional quality of the installations and the obvious investment of resources. How are they funding all this? That's one of the most disturbing aspects of the situation. They have financial backing from legitimate sources, wealthy individuals who share their political philosophy, corporations that profit from government instability, even some foreign entities that benefit from American domestic discord. Foreign entities? Russia, China, Iran? Anyone who gains a strategic advantage from weakening American political cohesion. They're not directly controlling these organizations, but they're happy to provide financial support and intelligence assets. The implications of that revelation hit Clayton like a physical blow. If Sullivan was telling the truth, Colonel Brennan's patriotic rhetoric was being funded by America's enemies. The Constitutional Defense Network wasn't defending the homeland. They were unwittingly serving foreign interests while believing they were saving the country. Sheriff, we need your help to gather intelligence about their operations and their plans. Colonel Brennan made you an offer last night. We want you to accept it. You want me to go undercover with a terrorist organization. We want you to do exactly what you've been doing for the past 12 years. Protect your community. The difference is that now you'll be doing it while keeping us informed about threats that local law enforcement can't handle alone. Clayton leaned back in his chair, trying to process what Sullivan was asking. How long have you been watching them? The Constitutional Defense Network has been under surveillance for 3 years. We've identified most of their leadership, mapped their financial networks, and infiltrated several of their cells. But we need someone in a position of local authority who can provide intelligence about their operational plans. What about my deputy, Angela Rodriguez? They claim she's working with them now. Sullivan's expression darkened. Deputy Rodriguez has been providing them with information for approximately 6 months. We've been monitoring her communications, and she appears to genuinely believe in their mission. She's not a willing double agent. She's been recruited and radicalized. Jesus Christ. Clayton rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building. How many others? How deep does this go in local law enforcement? That's what we need to find out. The Constitutional Defense Network has been systematically targeting law enforcement personnel, veterans, and community leaders who might be susceptible to their recruitment message. They're building a shadow government structure, Sheriff. And they're doing it by convincing people like you that they're the real patriots. Sullivan pulled out another set of documents. These are intercepts from their communications networks. They're planning something they call Day Zero, a coordinated series of operations designed to demonstrate the federal government's inability to protect American communities. Clayton looked at the documents, noting dates, locations, and operational codes that meant nothing to him but obviously had significance to Sullivan. When? We believe within the next 6 to 12 months. The exact timing depends on external factors: economic instability, terrorist incidents, natural disasters. They're waiting for a crisis they can exploit. What kind of operations? False flag attacks blamed on terrorist organizations, orchestrated confrontations with federal authorities, possibly even assassination of government officials who oppose their ideology. Sullivan's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Sheriff, these people are planning to start a civil war, and they're going to use local law enforcement to legitimize their actions. The scope of what Sullivan was describing was almost impossible to comprehend. A nationwide conspiracy involving thousands of people, funded by foreign enemies, preparing to overthrow the American government through violence and deception. If it was true, then everything Colonel Brennan had told him about protecting communities was a lie designed to recruit unwitting accomplices. But if it wasn't true, if Sullivan was exaggerating the threat or misinterpreting the Constitutional Defense Network's intentions, then Clayton might be helping to destroy a legitimate patriotic organization that was genuinely trying to prepare for real threats. How do I know you're telling me the truth? Clayton asked. You don't. But consider this. Which scenario makes more sense? That a group of retired military officers has independently identified threats that the entire U.S. intelligence community has missed, or that foreign adversaries are funding domestic groups to weaken American political stability. It was a fair point, but it didn't resolve Clayton's fundamental dilemma. Either way, he was being asked to betray people who claimed to trust him, to participate in deception and manipulation that could have life-or-death consequences for his community. What exactly do you want me to do? Accept Brennan's offer. Attend their training sessions. Participate in their planning meetings. Report back to us on their capabilities, their timeline, and their specific targets. Sullivan handed him a small device that looked like a hearing aid. This is a communications device, completely undetectable, encrypted, with a range of about 50 miles. Use it to send us regular updates. And when they ask me to participate in actual operations, that depends on what kind of operations they are. We can't ask you to break the law or put innocent people at risk, but we do need to understand their plans before they move into the active phase. Clayton stared at the communication device, weighing his options. If he refused to cooperate with Sullivan, he'd be left alone to deal with a potential terrorist organization that had already compromised his deputy and possibly other members of his department. If he agreed to go undercover, he'd be risking his life and his family's safety in service of a federal investigation that might be based on incomplete or inaccurate intelligence. I need time to think about this. Time is exactly what we don't have, Sheriff. Brennan expects an answer soon, and delaying too long will make him suspicious. How soon? Tomorrow, maybe the day after. They're not patient people, and they don't like uncertainty. Sullivan closed his briefcase and stood up. Sheriff, I know this is a difficult decision, but I need you to understand something. Whether you help us or not, the Constitutional Defense Network is moving towards some kind of confrontation with federal authority. The question is whether that confrontation happens on their terms or ours. After Sullivan left, Clayton sat in his office for hours, staring at the communication device and trying to decide whether he was being recruited to save his country or destroy it. The morning sun was streaming through his window, painting everything in golden light that made the previous night's events seem almost surreal. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Angela Rodriguez. "Morning, Sheriff. I wanted to talk to you about something important. Can you meet me at the diner?" "What about Angela?" "About what happened last night, about the choices we all have to make." Clayton looked at the communication device again, then slipped it into his shirt pocket. "I'll be there in 15 minutes. As he walked out of his office, Clayton realized that whatever decision he made in the next few hours would determine not just his own fate, but potentially the future of his community and his country. The weight of that responsibility was almost crushing. But he'd been carrying the weight of other people's safety for 12 years as sheriff. The stakes were just higher now, and the enemy more dangerous than anything he'd ever faced before. The question was, who was the real enemy? The Roadhouse Diner sat on the outskirts of Alpine like a relic from another era, its neon sign flickering against the morning sky. Clayton had eaten breakfast there 3 times a week for the past 12 years, knew every waitress by name, and every item on the menu by heart. But as he pulled into the parking lot, the familiar place felt different somehow, contaminated by secrets and divided loyalties. Angela Rodriguez was already there, sitting in a corner booth with her back to the wall, a position that gave her a clear view of both entrances. She looked tired, older than her 31 years, and there was something in her posture that spoke of resignation rather than defiance. "Morning, Sheriff," she said as he slid into the booth across from her. "Thanks for coming." "Morning, Angela. You look like hell." "Feel like it too." She gestured to the waitress for more coffee. "Did you sleep at all last night?" "Some. You?" "Not much." She waited until the waitress had filled their cups and moved away before continuing. "Sheriff, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear me out before you decide whether to arrest me or fire me or whatever you're planning to do." Clayton added cream to his coffee, using the routine action to buy time while he decided how to play this conversation. Agent Sullivan's communication device felt heavy in his shirt pocket, a constant reminder that nothing he said or did could be completely honest anymore. "I'm listening. When they first approached me, it wasn't like what happened to you last night. It was gradual, professional, like legitimate law enforcement cooperation." Angela's voice was steady, but Clayton could hear the stress underneath. "They said they were federal contractors working on homeland security issues, that they needed local law enforcement contacts to help identify potential threats." "What kind of threats?" "Drug cartels, terrorist cells, human trafficking networks. Stuff that was already on our radar, but that we didn't have the resources to investigate properly." She took a sip of coffee, her hands steady despite everything. "They offered training, equipment, intelligence support. It sounded like exactly what small county law enforcement needed." "When did you realize it was something else?" "About 3 months in. That's when they started asking for more detailed information about federal law enforcement activity in the area. DEA operations, FBI investigations, Border Patrol schedules. And they started talking about political issues, about how the federal government was failing to protect American communities." Clayton studied her face, looking for signs of deception or rehearsed answers. Angela had been his deputy for 8 years, and he'd learned to read her tells. Right now, she seemed genuinely conflicted, not defiant or ideologically committed. "Did you believe what they were telling you?" "Some of it. Hell, most of it made sense, at least on the surface. We've both seen how federal agencies operate. Jurisdictional disputes, bureaucratic delays, political interference. How many times have we identified real threats that Washington ignored or bungled?" It was a fair point. Clayton had indeed spent years watching federal authorities fail to address problems that local law enforcement could see clearly. The frustration was real, and it made people like Angela vulnerable to recruitment by organizations that promised better solutions. What changed your mind? Last night? When they told me they'd made contact with you, that they were bringing you into the operation. That's when I realized this wasn't about homeland security or community protection. This was about something else entirely. What do you think it's about? Angela looked out the window at the parking lot, watching traffic move along Highway 90. I think they're planning to start a war, Sheriff. And I think they want to use people like us to legitimize it. The words hung in the air between them, confirmation of Clayton's own growing suspicions. Angela had reached the same conclusion he had, but she'd done it from inside the organization rather than as an outside observer. Clayton made his decision. Angela, I want you to keep working with them. Her head snapped back toward him, eyes wide with surprise. What? I want you to continue your relationship with the Constitutional Defense Network, but from now on you'll be reporting to me about everything they ask you to do. Sheriff, I don't understand. I'm asking you to help me protect this community from a threat that's bigger than either of us realized. Can you do that? Angela stared at him for a long moment, processing what he was asking. Finally, she nodded slowly. What do you need me to do? Keep attending their meetings. Keep providing them with the kind of information they expect, but document everything. Names, faces, locations, operational plans, and report back to me on a regular basis. Sheriff, these people are dangerous. If they find out we're working against them, then we'll deal with that when it happens. But Angela, understand this. After today, there's no going back. Once we start gathering intelligence against these people, we're committed to seeing it through to the end. And if the end means some of us don't survive? Clayton looked out at the morning traffic. Ordinary people going about their ordinary lives, unaware that their community might be about to become a battleground in a conflict they never asked for. Then, at least we'll have tried to do the right thing. 3 weeks later, Clayton Matthews was beginning to understand why people joined cults. The training facility in the Guadalupe Mountains was impressive. Professional obstacle courses, shooting ranges that rivaled military installations, and instructors who moved with the precision of special forces operators. More than that, it was the camaraderie that got to you. The sense of brotherhood, of belonging to something larger than yourself. Sheriff, you're improving, said Vernon Pike, the weapons instructor who'd been putting Clayton through his paces for the past 5 days. Your tactical shooting scores are in the top 10% of all recruits. Thanks, Vernon. Though I have to admit, this is a hell of a lot more intensive than I expected. Vernon was a lean man in his 50s with graying hair and scars on his hands that spoke of combat experience. Like most of the instructors at the facility, he was former military, special forces, from what Clayton had gathered. The kind of soldier who'd spent years in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, doing the kind of work that never made it into official reports. That's the idea, Sheriff. When day 0 comes, there won't be time for on-the-job training. You'll need to be ready to act immediately, decisively, without hesitation. Day 0. Clayton had been hearing that phrase constantly during his time at the facility, but nobody had yet explained exactly what it meant. From the context, it seemed to be some kind of coordinated action that would demonstrate the Constitutional Defense Network's capabilities to the American people. But the specifics remained classified, available only to what they called Level 3 personnel. Vernon, I've been thinking about something Colonel Brennan mentioned during our initial meeting. About the threats this country is facing, about the need for people like us to be prepared. What specifically? He said we have maybe 18 months, maybe 2 years, before some kind of major incident forces the issue. What kind of incident are we talking about? Vernon stopped adjusting the rifle sight he'd been working on and looked directly at Clayton. Sheriff, how much do you know about asymmetric warfare? Some. I served in the Gulf War, saw how effective irregular forces could be against conventional military units. Then you understand that the greatest threat to American security isn't foreign armies or nuclear weapons. It's the enemy that hides among the civilian population, that uses our own infrastructure against us, that turns our diversity into weakness. Clayton kept his expression neutral, but internally, he was taking notes. This was exactly the kind of intelligence Agent Sullivan needed. Specific information about the Constitutional Defense Network's ideology and operational philosophy. You're talking about domestic terrorist cells? I'm talking about a coordinated campaign to destroy American society from within. Islamic terrorist groups, Mexican cartel soldiers, Chinese intelligence operatives, domestic communist organizations, they're all working together, Sheriff. And they're being supported by elements within our own government. Elements within the government? Vernon lowered his voice, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. Sheriff, what I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this conversation. We have intelligence sources that confirm high-level penetration of federal agencies by hostile foreign powers. The FBI, CIA, Department of Homeland Security, they've all been compromised. Clayton felt a chill run down his spine. If Vernon was telling the truth, then Agent Sullivan's investigation might itself be part of the conspiracy the Constitutional Defense Network claimed to be fighting. But if Vernon was lying, or if he'd been fed disinformation by his own organization, then Clayton was being recruited to participate in a terrorist operation based on paranoid delusions. That's a serious accusation, Vernon. It's a serious situation. That's why organizations like ours exist, to protect American communities when the official channels have been corrupted or compromised. They were interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching the training facility. Clayton looked toward the main gate and saw a convoy of black SUVs and military-style trucks kicking up dust clouds as they approached. Even at a distance, he could see they were heavily armed and moving with tactical precision. "Looks like we've got company," Vernon said, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm. The convoy stopped at the main gate, and Clayton could see uniformed personnel dismounting from the vehicles. They weren't wearing standard military uniforms. These looked like private military contractor gear, the kind used by companies that did work in places where official U.S. forces weren't supposed to operate. Colonel Brennan's voice came over the facility's public address system. "All personnel report to the main assembly area immediately. This is not a drill." Clayton and Vernon joined the stream of trainees and instructors moving toward the central courtyard. There were about 60 people at the facility, far more than Clayton had initially realized. Most appeared to be current or former law enforcement and military personnel, but he could see some who looked like civilians. Doctors, engineers, communications specialists, the kind of people who would be essential for maintaining a shadow government structure. Colonel Brennan stood on a raised platform at the front of the assembly area, flanked by the men from the convoy. They wore no visible rank insignia or name tags, but their bearing suggested senior military or intelligence backgrounds. "Ladies and gentlemen," Brennan began, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard. "I want you to meet some associates who've been working with us on operational planning. These men represent organizations that share our commitment to defending American communities from the threats our government refuses to acknowledge." One of the men stepped forward. He was maybe 50 years old, with silver hair and the kind of expensive suit that suggested significant financial resources. My name is Marcus Dalton. I represent a consortium of American patriot organizations that have been tracking the same threats you've been training to counter. Clayton's blood ran cold. Marcus Dalton. He'd heard that name in Agent Sullivan's briefing. Dalton was suspected of being a Russian intelligence asset, someone who funneled foreign money to domestic groups that served Moscow's interests. Mr. Dalton brings us intelligence about an imminent threat to American security, Brennan continued. A coordinated terrorist operation that will target multiple American cities simultaneously. Federal law enforcement agencies are either unaware of this threat or have been instructed to ignore it for political reasons. Dalton stepped to the microphone. According to our intelligence sources, Islamic terrorist cells operating in conjunction with Mexican cartel soldiers are planning to detonate radiological devices in at least 6 major American cities. The attacks are scheduled to occur during the next 90 days. A murmur ran through the assembled personnel. If what Dalton was saying was true, it would be the largest terrorist attack in American history. The death toll would be catastrophic, and the economic and social disruption would be beyond calculation. The federal government's response will be inadequate, Dalton continued. They'll declare martial law, suspend constitutional rights, and use the crisis to expand federal power at the expense of local communities. That's when organizations like yours will be called upon to provide real security for American citizens. Clayton was beginning to understand the true scope of what the Constitutional Defense Network was planning. They weren't preparing to respond to terrorist attacks. They were planning to use the threat of terrorism to justify their own armed intervention in American communities. Day 0, Brennan said, taking back the microphone, will be the day that patriotic Americans take responsibility for protecting their own communities. Local law enforcement, supported by trained militia units, will provide security when federal agencies fail or refuse to act. What exactly does that mean? Asked one of the trainees, a deputy sheriff from Arizona. It means that when the attacks begin, when federal authorities prove incapable of protecting American citizens, local law enforcement personnel who've been trained and equipped through programs like this one will step in to fill the void. Clayton raised his hand. Colonel, are you talking about martial law, about military units operating under local authority? I'm talking about constitutional law, Sheriff. The inherent right of local communities to protect themselves when higher authorities fail in their duties. The implications were staggering. The Constitutional Defense Network wasn't just planning to provide security during a crisis. They were planning to replace federal authority with their own shadow government structure. And they were using the threat of terrorism to justify actions that would amount to an armed insurrection. After the assembly, Clayton made his way to the communications building where he'd been told he could make secure phone calls to his office. The building was heavily shielded, designed to prevent electronic surveillance, but Clayton hoped Agent Sullivan's communication device would still function. He activated the device and sent a brief, coded message. Major development. Imminent timeline. Need immediate extraction. Within minutes, he received a reply. Extraction not possible. Maintain cover. Document everything. Clayton deleted both messages and returned to his assigned quarters. That night, he lay awake staring at the ceiling, trying to process what he'd learned. If Marcus Dalton's intelligence was accurate, American cities were about to be attacked by terrorist organizations. If it wasn't accurate, if it was disinformation designed to justify the Constitutional Defense Network's planned operations, then Clayton was trapped inside a conspiracy that was preparing to wage war against the U.S. government. Either way, the next 90 days were going to determine the future of American democracy. The next morning brought news that made Clayton's blood freeze. Angela Rodriguez was dead. Colonel Brennan delivered the information during the morning briefing, his voice carefully neutral. I regret to inform you that Deputy Angela Rodriguez, Sheriff Matthews' associate from Brewster County, was killed in an automobile accident yesterday evening. She apparently lost control of her vehicle on a mountain road and went over a cliff. Clayton felt the world tilt around him. Angela had been his lifeline, his only trusted contact in a world of lies and deception. Without her, he was completely alone inside an organization that might be planning to destroy everything he'd sworn to protect. Sheriff Matthews, Brennan continued, you have my condolences. I know Deputy Rodriguez was a valued member of your team. Thank you, Colonel. I'll need to return to Alpine to handle the arrangements. Of course, but Sheriff, I hope this tragedy won't interfere with your commitment to our mission. Deputy Rodriguez believed in what we're doing here. She wouldn't want her sacrifice to be meaningless. Sacrifice. Brennan had called Angela's death a sacrifice, as if it had been intentional rather than accidental. Clayton began to understand that Angela hadn't died in a car accident. She'd been murdered because the Constitutional Defense Network suspected she was compromising their security. That evening, as Clayton packed his gear for the return to Alpine, Vernon Pike approached him with a concerned expression. Sheriff, I heard about your deputy. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you, Vernon. I also wanted to give you some advice. There are people in this organization who don't trust outsiders completely. They're watching for signs of divided loyalty, for people who might compromise operational security. What kind of signs? Questions about Day Zero, attempts to contact outside authorities, behavior that suggests someone might be working for federal agencies. Vernon's voice dropped to a whisper. Sheriff, I like you. You seem like a genuine patriot. But some of the security people think you might be a federal plant. Your questions, your background, the fact that you stumbled onto our Morrison Ranch operation at exactly the right time to be recruited. Vernon shook his head. It could all be coincidence, but in this business, there are no coincidences. What do you think, Vernon? I think you're exactly what you appear to be, a county sheriff who wants to protect his community. But Sheriff, you need to be careful. There are people here who would rather eliminate a potential security risk than take chances with operational security. Clayton drove back to Alpine with Vernon's warning echoing in his mind. Angela was dead, his cover might be blown, and he was carrying intelligence about a potential terrorist attack that could kill thousands of Americans. The question was, who could he trust with information that could save lives or start a war? When he reached his office, Clayton found a message waiting for him. Agent Sullivan wanted to meet immediately at the same rest area where they'd first discussed the undercover operation. Clayton arrived to find Sullivan waiting with backup. 2 other federal agents and a mobile command unit disguised as a recreational vehicle. The look on Sullivan's face suggested that whatever they'd learned during Clayton's absence wasn't good news. Sheriff, we need to debrief you immediately. Our intelligence indicates that the Constitutional Defense Network is moving into the operational phase of whatever they're planning. They're talking about terrorist attacks on American cities within the next 90 days. Radiological devices, coordinated strikes, mass casualties. Sullivan's expression darkened. Sheriff, we need you to understand something. There are no terrorist attacks planned. The intelligence Marcus Dalton provided is fabricated, designed to justify the Constitutional Defense Network's own operations. You're saying it's all fake? We're saying that the Constitutional Defense Network is planning to stage false flag attacks that they'll blame on terrorist organizations. They'll use the chaos to seize control of local governments and declare federal authority invalid. Clayton felt sick. He'd spent 3 weeks training with people who were planning to murder innocent Americans in order to justify their own seizure of power. People who'd already murdered Angela Rodriguez to protect their operational security. What do you need me to do? Nothing. Your cover is blown. They know you're working with federal authorities. We're extracting you immediately, and we'll use the intelligence you've gathered to begin making arrests. What about the people in those training facilities? What about the other law enforcement personnel who've been recruited? They'll be arrested along with the rest. Sheriff, everyone who participated in Constitutional Defense Network operations is going to be charged with conspiracy to commit terrorism and treason against the United States. Clayton stared at Sullivan, processing what he was being told. Even the people who thought they were protecting their communities, even the ones who believed they were serving their country, especially those people, Sheriff. They're the most dangerous conspirators of all, the ones who commit treason while believing they're patriots. As federal agents swarmed the Constitutional Defense Network's facilities across 12 states, Clayton Matthews sat in his office in Alpine and thought about the price of good intentions. Angela Rodriguez had died because she'd tried to do the right thing. Dozens of law enforcement officers were about to be arrested because they'd believed they were protecting their communities. And somewhere in the darkness between truth and lies, between patriotism and treason, the real enemies of America were probably laughing at how easy it had been to turn Americans against each other. The final irony was that in trying to save his country, Clayton had helped destroy the lives of people who'd only wanted to serve it. In a world where everyone claimed to be a patriot, it was getting harder and harder to tell who the real enemy was. The phone on his desk rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. Brewster County Sheriff's Department. Sheriff Matthews, this is Colonel Wade Brennan. I think we need to have one final conversation. Clayton's blood turned to ice. Brennan should have been in federal custody by now, along with the rest of the Constitutional Defense Network leadership. The fact that he was free to make phone calls suggested that the federal operation hadn't gone as planned. I think you're right, Colonel. Where would you like to meet? Same place we first talked, Sheriff. The Morrison Ranch. Come alone and come tonight. It's time to settle this once and for all. The line went dead, leaving Clayton staring at the phone and wondering who he could trust in a world where everyone claimed to be fighting for the same cause. Sheriff Garrett McAllister had been staring at the missing person report for 3 hours, and it still didn't make sense. Misty Brennan, 19 years old, experienced hiker, had vanished somewhere in the Sangre de Cristo wilderness 3 days ago. Her hiking partner, Crystal Valdez, had managed to make it back to the trailhead after spending 2 nights lost in the mountains, but her story kept changing every time someone asked her about it. She said they got separated during a storm, Deputy Brock Hansen said, setting a fresh cup of coffee on Garrett's desk. But the Weather Service says there wasn't any storm activity in that area on Tuesday. Garrett rubbed his eyes and looked at the topographical map spread across his desk. The Sangre de Cristo Range covered nearly 200 square miles of some of the most rugged country in northern New Mexico. Dense forests, deep canyons, elevations ranging from 7,000 feet to over 13,000. It was the kind of terrain that could hide a body forever, or swallow someone alive without leaving a trace. What about her equipment? Did Crystal say what Misty was carrying? Full backpack, sleeping bag, 3 days of food and water, GPS unit, cell phone, emergency beacon. Brock consulted his notes. Plus, Crystal says Misty was one of those prepared types, always carried extra gear in case something went wrong. That was what bothered Garrett most about the situation. Experienced hikers with proper equipment didn't just disappear in familiar territory. Misty Brennan had been hiking the Sangre de Cristo Trail since she was in high school. She knew the area better than most of the search and rescue volunteers who'd been looking for her. Have we heard anything from the emergency beacon? Negative. Either it's not working or... Brock didn't finish the sentence, but they both knew what he was thinking. Emergency beacons were designed to activate automatically in certain situations. If Misty's wasn't transmitting, it either meant she was somewhere the signal couldn't get out, or she was in no condition to activate it manually. The door to the sheriff's office opened and Crystal Valdez walked in, escorted by Deputy Rodriguez. Crystal looked like she'd been through hell. Sunburned, dehydrated, scratches on her arms and face from bushwhacking through heavy brush. But there was something in her eyes that Garrett couldn't quite identify. Not fear, exactly, and not grief. Something else. Miss Valdez, thanks for coming in. I know this is difficult, but I need to go over your statement one more time. Crystal sat down in the chair across from his desk, her hands folded in her lap. She was a small woman, maybe 5'4", with short brown hair and the kind of lean build that came from serious outdoor activity. I've already told everyone what happened. We got separated in the storm. I spent 2 days trying to find her. Finally, had to hike out for help. The thing is, Crystal, we can't find any record of storm activity in that area on Tuesday. No rain, no high winds. Visibility was clear all day. Crystal's expression didn't change. Maybe your weather service is wrong. I know what I experienced. Garrett spread the topographical map on his desk and turned it so Crystal could see it clearly. Show me exactly where you last saw Misty. Crystal studied the map for several minutes, her finger tracing various trails and landmarks. Finally, she pointed to an area near Hermit Peak, about 15 miles from the main trailhead. Right here. We were following the ridge trail when the weather started getting bad. And where did you go after you got separated? I tried to follow her, but the visibility was too poor. I ended up spending the night under a rock overhang, then tried to find the trail again the next morning. Garrett made notes on the map, marking the locations Crystal had indicated. Search and rescue teams had been concentrating their efforts in a 3-mile radius around Hermit Peak, but so far they'd found no trace of Misty Brennan or her equipment. Crystal, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Is there any reason Misty might have wanted to disappear on her own? Any problems at home, relationship issues, anything that might have made her want to start over somewhere else? Crystal shook her head immediately. Number Misty was happy. She had a good job. She was engaged to a guy named Derek who treats her great. She was planning to start graduate school in the fall. There's no way she'd just disappear. What about money problems? Drug problems? Anything that might have put her in danger? Misty doesn't even drink alcohol, much less use drugs. And she's got plenty of money. Her parents own that big construction company in Santa Fe. Garrett knew about the Brennan family. Irish immigrants who'd built one of the most successful construction businesses in northern New Mexico over the past 20 years. They had money, connections, and the kind of political influence that meant this case was getting attention from people far above his pay grade. Crystal, I'm going to be direct with you. Your story has some inconsistencies. The Weather Service says there was no storm. The GPS data from your phone shows some unusual patterns of movement during the time you claim to have been lost. And frankly, you don't seem as upset about your friend's disappearance as I would expect. Crystal's composure cracked just slightly. I'm dealing with this my own way. Just because I'm not crying all the time doesn't mean I don't care what happened to her. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that I think you know more than you're telling me." Crystal stood up abruptly. "Am I under arrest? Should you be? I've told you everything I know. If you want to waste time questioning me instead of looking for Misty, that's your choice. But every hour you spend in here is another hour she's out there alone." After Crystal left, Garrett called the search and rescue coordinator and requested an expansion of the search area. If Misty had wandered away from the Hermit Peak area, she could be anywhere in the 50-square-mile region of wilderness. Finding her would require more resources than Taos County could provide on its own. "Sheriff," Brock said, appearing in the doorway, "I've been going through Crystal Valdez's background, and there's something you need to see." Brock handed him a folder containing printouts from social media sites and credit card records. Crystal's been having financial problems for the past 6 months. Credit cards maxed out. Behind on rent, her car was almost repossessed last month. "What does she do for work?" "Waitress at a restaurant in Santa Fe, makes maybe $20,000 a year. But look at this." Brock showed him a bank statement. 3 days before the hiking trip, someone deposited $15,000 in cash into Crystal's checking account. Garrett studied the statement. The deposit had been made at a branch in Albuquerque, 2 hours south of Santa Fe. There was no indication of who had made the deposit or where the money had come from. Any idea who might have given her $15,000? That's the interesting part. The deposit was made the same day Misty Brennan withdrew $15,000 from her trust fund account. Garrett felt that familiar tingle at the base of his skull, the one he'd learned to trust over the years. So, Misty gives Crystal $15,000. And 3 days later, Crystal comes back from a hiking trip claiming Misty disappeared in a storm that never happened. That's what it looks like. Get me everything we can find on Crystal Valdez. Bank records, phone records, social media activity, employment history. And I want to talk to Misty Brennan's parents. The Brennan family lived in the hills north of Santa Fe, in one of those adobe mansions that looked like it had been transplanted from a magazine about southwestern architecture. Michael and Patricia Brennan met Garrett at the front door, their faces drawn with worry and exhaustion. "Sheriff McAllister, thank you for coming," Michael said, shaking hands with a grip that spoke of decades in the construction business. "Any news about Misty?" "I'm afraid not, Mr. Brennan, but I wanted to ask you some questions about your daughter's relationship with Crystal Valdez." They sat in a living room that probably cost more than Garrett made in 5 years, but the expensive furniture and artwork couldn't hide the strain of having a missing child. "Crystal's been Misty's best friend since high school," Patricia said. "They've been hiking together for years. Crystal introduced Misty to the sport, actually. What can you tell me about Crystal's financial situation?" Michael and Patricia exchanged a look. "We know she's been struggling," Michael said finally. "Misty mentioned that Crystal was having trouble making ends meet, worried about losing her apartment." "Did Misty ever give Crystal money?" "Sometimes. Small amounts, maybe a few $100s here and there. Misty has a generous heart, sometimes too generous." The warrant for Crystal Valdez's apartment came through at 8 in the morning, just as the expanded search teams were heading into the wilderness. Garrett decided to execute the search personally, bringing Deputy Hansen and a crime scene technician with him. If they found evidence that Crystal had harmed Misty, he wanted to make sure the chain of custody was bulletproof. Crystal lived in a rundown apartment complex on the outskirts of Santa Fe, the kind of place where people minded their own business and didn't ask too many questions about their neighbors. Her unit was on the 2nd floor, overlooking a parking lot full of rusted cars and overflowing dumpsters. "She's not here," the building manager said, unlocking the door with hands that shook, slightly Haven't seen her since yesterday morning. Seemed nervous about something, kept looking over her shoulder. The apartment was small and cramped, furnished with second-hand furniture and decorated with hiking photographs that showed Crystal and Misty on various outdoor adventures. They looked genuinely happy in the pictures. Two young women enjoying the wilderness together, sharing the kind of friendship that was supposed to last a lifetime. "Start with the bedroom," Garrett told Hansen. "Look for anything that might indicate premeditation, maps, research materials, anything that shows she was planning this trip in detail." The crime scene technician began photographing everything while Garrett focused on Crystal's computer. The browser history that Hansen had discovered was still there. Searches for information about hiking accidents, missing persons cases, and remote areas of the Sangre de Cristo wilderness. But it was what he found in her email that made his blood run cold. 3 weeks before the hiking trip, Crystal had been in contact with someone using an encrypted email service. The messages were brief and cryptic, but their meaning was clear enough. Package will be delivered as discussed. 15 will be sufficient for expenses. Cleanup must be thorough, understood. Timeline still acceptable? Weather window is important. Yes, make it look natural. No traces. The final email had been sent the night before Crystal and Misty left for their hiking trip. Everything is in place. She suspects nothing. Garrett printed the emails and called for a computer forensics expert to analyze the hard drive. If Crystal was working with an accomplice, they needed to identify that person as quickly as possible. "Sheriff," Hansen called from the bedroom. "You need to see this." Hansen was standing beside Crystal's dresser, holding a manila envelope that had been hidden beneath a stack of clothing. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, all of Misty Brennan. Some appeared to have been taken without Misty's knowledge, showing her at work, at home, on other hiking trips. Others were more intimate, showing Misty sleeping, changing clothes, or in other private moments. "This is stalking behavior," Hansen said. "She's been obsessed with Misty for months, maybe years." At the bottom of the envelope was something that made Garrett's stomach turn. Detailed notes about Misty's daily routine, her work schedule, her relationship with her fiancé, even her banking information and trust fund access codes. "She's been planning this for a long time," Garrett said. "This wasn't a crime of opportunity. This was premeditated murder." The crime scene technician found more evidence in the bathroom. A small vial of what appeared to be sedatives, hidden behind the mirror in the medicine cabinet. The label had been removed, but laboratory analysis would determine what kind of drug it was and whether it could incapacitate someone without killing them immediately. If she drugged Misty during the hike, that would explain why there's been no signal from the emergency beacon, Hansen said. Misty might be unconscious somewhere, unable to call for help. Garrett's phone rang, interrupting his examination of the evidence. It was the search and rescue coordinator. "Sheriff, we found something in the North Canyon area. You need to get out here." "What kind of something?" "Equipment, backpack, sleeping bag, some scattered gear. No sign of the hiker, but there's blood on the rocks." Garrett felt his pulse quicken. How much blood? Enough to suggest serious injury, maybe fatal. Secure the scene. Don't let anyone contaminate potential evidence. We're on our way. The drive to the search area took 90 minutes, following Forest Service roads that were barely more than dirt tracks through the wilderness. Garrett used the time to call the district attorney and request an arrest warrant for Crystal Valdez on charges of kidnapping and suspected murder. The North Canyon area was exactly the kind of remote location that Crystal had been researching online. A deep ravine accessible only by a steep, unmarked trail that most hikers would never attempt. It was the perfect place to hide evidence of a crime. "Over here, Sheriff," called Jake Morrison, the search and rescue team leader. Morrison was a 20-year veteran of wilderness recovery operations, the kind of man who could read a crime scene in the mountains as clearly as a detective could read one in the city. The equipment was scattered across a small clearing near the canyon rim, as if it had been thrown or dropped in haste. Misty's backpack was torn open, its contents strewn across the rocky ground. Her sleeping bag was tangled around a dead tree, and her GPS unit was smashed against a boulder. "What do you think happened here?" Garrett asked. Morrison pointed to the blood splattered on the rocks near the canyon's edge. "Looks like a struggle. Someone was injured, maybe thrown or pushed. The blood pattern suggests impact trauma. Head wound, probably. Could someone survive a fall from here?" Morrison looked over the canyon rim, studying the terrain below. It's about a 200-foot drop to the bottom. Rock face most of the way down. No vegetation to break the fall. If someone went over this edge, they'd be dead before they hit the bottom. Garrett examined the area more carefully, looking for signs of what had happened. The blood pattern was consistent with Morrison's analysis. Someone had suffered a serious head injury at this location, but there were other details that bothered him. "Jake, look at how the equipment is scattered. If Misty fell or was pushed over the edge, why is her gear up here? Wouldn't it have gone over with her? Unless someone removed it first, maybe, as a way to hide evidence of what really happened. Or to make it look like an accident instead of murder." They spent the next 2 hours documenting the scene and collecting evidence. The blood samples would be tested to confirm they belonged to Misty Brennan, but Garrett was already convinced they'd found the location where Crystal had killed her friend. The question was, where was the body? "Sheriff," one of the search volunteers called from farther down the trail. "I found something else." The volunteer was standing beside a large pile of rocks that had been deliberately stacked, what wilderness experts called a cairn, used to mark trails or significant locations. But this cairn was different. It was too large, too carefully constructed, and it was located well away from any established trail. "Help me move these rocks," Garrett said. They worked carefully, documenting each rock's position before moving it. Underneath, they found freshly disturbed earth, soil that had been dug up and then carefully replaced. "This is a grave," Morrison said quietly. "Someone buried something here." Garrett called for the coroner and a full forensics team. If Misty Brennan's body was buried under this cairn, they needed to recover it properly to preserve any evidence that might still exist. While they waited for the forensics team to arrive, Garrett's phone rang. It was the dispatcher from his office. "Sheriff, we've got a problem. Crystal Valdez just walked into the state police station in Albuquerque. She's asking for a lawyer and claiming she wants to confess to something." Garrett felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. If Crystal was ready to confess, it might save them weeks of investigation. But it also meant they might never recover Misty's body or understand exactly what had happened in these mountains. "Tell the state police not to question her until I get there, and make sure they know this is a potential murder case, not just a missing person." The drive to Albuquerque took 3 hours, leaving Garrett plenty of time to think about what Crystal might be planning. Voluntary confessions were often more complicated than they appeared. Sometimes suspects confessed to lesser crimes to avoid being charged with more serious ones. Crystal was waiting in an interview room at the state police station, accompanied by a public defender who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. Crystal had changed clothes since Garrett had last seen her. Gone were the hiking boots and outdoor gear, replaced by a simple dress and cardigan that made her look younger and more vulnerable. "Miss Valdez, I'm Sheriff McAllister. I understand you want to make a statement about Misty Brennan's disappearance." Crystal nodded, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I need to tell someone what really happened. I can't live with this anymore. Before we begin, I need to inform you of your rights." Garrett read Crystal the Miranda warning, making sure she understood that anything she said could be used against her in court. "I understand," Crystal said when he finished. "Sheriff, I want you to know that I never meant for any of this to happen. Misty was my best friend. I loved her like a sister." "Then tell me what happened, Crystal." "Tell me the truth." Crystal took a deep breath and began to speak. "Misty didn't disappear in a storm. There was no storm. I gave her something to make her sleep." "What did you give her?" "Sleeping pills. I crushed them up and put them in her water bottle during lunch on Tuesday. She started getting drowsy about an hour later, said she needed to rest. And then what happened? She fell asleep on the trail. I thought I could just leave her there, take her equipment, make it look like she got lost. I needed the money she'd given me, but I knew if I just kept it, her parents would ask questions." Garrett made notes while Crystal talked, but something about her story didn't add up. "Crystal, if you left Misty sleeping on the trail, how do you explain the blood we found at the canyon location?" Crystal's composure cracked. She started crying, her whole body shaking with sobs. "She woke up. I thought the pills would keep her asleep for hours, but she woke up and realized what I'd done. She was angry, said she was going to call the police." "So you attacked her?" "No, it wasn't like that. She tried to grab her phone to call for help, and I tried to stop her. We struggled, and she hit her head on a rock. There was so much blood." "Was she still alive when you left her?" Crystal nodded miserably. "She was unconscious, but still breathing. I panicked. I didn't know what to do, so I scattered her equipment around to make it look like an accident and then hiked out. Crystal, we found a grave. We found where you buried her body." "What? No, that's not... I didn't bury her. I swear she was still alive when I left." Garrett studied Crystal's face, looking for signs of deception. She seemed genuinely shocked by the mention of the grave, but she could be lying about that too. "If you didn't bury her, then who did?" "I don't know. Maybe she died from her injuries in animals, or maybe someone else found her." The interview continued for 2 more hours, but Crystal's story remained consistent. She admitted to drugging Misty, to struggling with her and causing the head injury, and to staging the scene to look like an accident. But she insisted that Misty had been alive when she left the mountain, which meant that either Crystal was lying about the most important part of her confession, or someone else had found Misty Brennan's injured body and buried it under that pile of rocks. The forensics team called while Garrett was driving back to Taos. They'd excavated the cairn and found human remains, a young woman matching Misty's description, buried in a shallow grave with obvious head trauma. But there was something else, something that changed everything. "Sheriff," the forensic investigator said, "the victim didn't die from the head injury. She died from manual strangulation. Someone choked her to death after she was already injured." Garrett felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place, forming a picture that was far more disturbing than simple murder for money. Crystal Valdez had drugged and injured Misty Brennan, but she hadn't killed her. Someone else had found the injured woman and finished what Crystal had started. The question was, who else had been in those mountains that day, and why had they decided to murder a helpless young woman? The encrypted emails from Crystal's computer revealed their secrets under forensic analysis. The mysterious correspondent had been using a sophisticated relay system to hide their identity, but digital breadcrumbs always led somewhere if you knew how to follow them. 3 days after finding Misty's body, the FBI's cybercrime unit traced the communications to a source that made Garrett's blood run cold. Dr. Vernon Ash, a respected psychiatrist from Albuquerque with a practice that catered to wealthy clients and a reputation for helping people through difficult life transitions. He was 56 years old, married, with 2 grown children and a sterling professional reputation. He was also, according to the digital evidence, Crystal's handler in what appeared to be a carefully orchestrated murder scheme. Dr. Ash has been under investigation for insurance fraud, explained Special Agent Kate Morrison, who'd been assigned to coordinate with local law enforcement on what was now being called the Brennan murder case. Nothing we could prove, but several of his patients have died under suspicious circumstances over the past 5 years. Garrett studied the case files Morrison had brought. 3 different patients, all wealthy individuals going through personal crises: divorce, bankruptcy, family disputes over inheritance. All had died in what appeared to be accidents or suicides, but all had recently changed their life insurance beneficiaries or made large cash withdrawals before their deaths. What's the connection to Crystal Valdez? She was one of his patients. Started seeing him about 8 months ago for depression and anxiety. According to his records, she was having severe financial problems and mentioned that she resented her wealthy friend's lifestyle. The pattern was becoming clear. Dr. Ash had identified vulnerable patients with access to wealthy targets, then manipulated them into committing crimes that he could profit from while maintaining plausible deniability. Crystal had been the weapon, but Ash had been the one pulling the trigger. Why kill Misty himself? Why not just let Crystal handle the whole thing? Because Crystal lost her nerve. She drugged Misty and staged the accident, but she couldn't go through with murder. Dr. Ash was monitoring the situation. He probably had tracking devices on both women. And when he realized Crystal had failed to complete the job, he went up there to finish it personally. How do we prove it? Morrison pulled out a photograph taken by a Forest Service camera used to monitor wildlife in the Sangre de Cristo wilderness. The image showed a man in hiking gear walking along a trail, date-stamped for the same day Misty had disappeared. Facial recognition software confirms it's Dr. Ash. He was in the wilderness that day, despite telling investigators he was in his office seeing patients. Garrett looked at the timestamp. Dr. Ash had been photographed on the trail just 3 hours after Crystal claimed to have left Misty unconscious and bleeding. Plenty of time for him to find the injured woman and make a decision that would change everything. There's something else, Morrison continued. We've been monitoring Dr. Ash's communication since we identified him as a suspect. Yesterday, he made contact with another potential accomplice. She handed Garrett a transcript of intercepted phone calls. Dr. Ash had been speaking with someone identified only as Rex about another opportunity, involving a troubled patient and a wealthy target. He's planning to do this again. That's what we think, and we want to stop him before another innocent person dies. The plan they developed was risky but necessary. Garrett would pose as a potential patient, someone with financial problems and access to a wealthy target. He'd wear a wire, gather evidence of Dr. Ash's methods, and try to identify the next potential victim before it was too late. Are you comfortable doing this, Sheriff? Morrison asked. Dr. Ash is clearly a dangerous individual. If he suspects your law enforcement, your life could be at risk. Garrett thought about Misty Brennan, about the terror she must have felt when she woke up injured and helpless in the wilderness, only to have a stranger emerge from the forest to murder her with his bare hands. I'm comfortable with it. The appointment was set for the following Tuesday. Garrett spent the weekend preparing his cover story, a divorced sheriff with gambling debts and a wealthy ex-wife who'd taken most of his assets in the settlement. It was close enough to reality to be believable, but different enough to protect his actual family situation. Dr. Ash's office was in an upscale medical complex in Albuquerque, all glass and marble and expensive artwork. The waiting room was filled with the kind of people who could afford to pay cash for psychiatric services. Well-dressed, well-groomed, and radiating the particular kind of anxiety that came with having a lot to lose. "Mr. Matthews?" The receptionist was a young woman with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Dr. Ash will see you now." Dr. Ash himself was exactly what Garrett had expected from his photographs. Tall, silver-haired, with the kind of polished appearance that inspired confidence in troubled patients. His handshake was firm, his smile warm, and his office was decorated with degrees and awards that testified to decades of successful practice. "Please, have a seat, Doctor," Ash said, gesturing to a leather chair positioned across from his desk. "I understand you're going through some difficult times." "That's putting it mildly, Doc. My divorce was finalized 6 months ago, and I'm still trying to figure out how to rebuild my life." Divorce can be one of life's most challenging experiences. "Tell me about your situation." Garrett launched into his prepared story, describing financial problems, emotional struggles, and resentment toward his ex-wife who'd kept most of their assets. Dr. Ash listened with apparent sympathy, asking probing questions about specific details. "And your ex-wife? She's doing well financially?" "Better than well. She got the house, the investments, even my pension. Meanwhile, I'm living in a studio apartment and trying to figure out how to pay off the gambling debts I accumulated trying to cope with the stress." Dr. Ash made notes on a legal pad, his expression thoughtful. "Mr. Matthews, I want you to understand that what we discuss here is completely confidential. Patient-doctor privilege protects everything you tell me." "I appreciate that, Doc." "Good, because I'm going to ask you some questions that might seem unusual, but they're designed to help me understand your psychological profile and determine the best course of treatment." The questions that followed were indeed unusual. Dr. Ash wanted to know about Garrett's access to his ex-wife's daily routine, her security arrangements, her travel plans. He asked about Garrett's military background, his weapons training, his knowledge of wilderness areas. "Doc, these questions seem kind of specific. Are you planning some kind of exposure therapy?" Dr. Ash smiled, but there was something cold in his expression. "In a sense, yes. Mr. Matthews, I'm going to share something with you that I only discuss with certain patients, those who I believe are ready to take control of their lives in a more direct way." "What do you mean?" "I mean that sometimes the traditional therapeutic approaches aren't sufficient. Sometimes people need more practical solutions to their problems." Dr. Ash opened a file drawer and pulled out a folder containing photographs. The images showed Crystal Valdez, both before and after her treatment with Dr. Ash. The before photos showed a depressed, anxious young woman. The after photos showed her looking confident and determined. "Crystal was very much like you when she first came to me," Dr. Ash said. "Financial problems, resentment toward a wealthy friend who seemed to have everything handed to her. Traditional therapy wasn't helping, so we explored alternative approaches." "What kind of alternatives?" "Direct action. Crystal's friend was planning a hiking trip, and Crystal saw an opportunity to resolve her financial difficulties permanently." Garrett felt his pulse quicken. Dr. Ash was actually describing his role in Misty's murder, speaking about it as if it were a legitimate therapeutic intervention. "Are you saying she killed her friend?" "I'm saying she took control of her situation instead of remaining a victim, and as a result, her financial problems were resolved." "But what about the consequences? The legal risk?" Dr. Ash leaned back in his chair, his expression confident. "Mr. Matthews, the key to any successful intervention is proper planning and execution. Crystal's case required some Adjustments, but ultimately achieved the desired outcome. Adjustments. He was talking about personally murdering Misty Brennan as if it were a minor modification to a treatment plan. Doc, I have to ask, are you talking about murder? I'm talking about survival, Mr. Matthews, about taking action to protect yourself and your future when the legal system has failed you. Dr. Ash's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Your ex-wife took everything from you through legal manipulation. Traditional therapy isn't going to get your life back, but direct action might. What kind of direct action? Dr. Ash opened another folder. This one containing what appeared to be surveillance photographs of a woman Garrett didn't recognize. I have another patient who's facing a situation very similar to yours. A wealthy target who's made life difficult for someone who deserves better. We could coordinate efforts, share resources, provide mutual support. You want me to kill my ex-wife? I want you to consider all your options, and I want you to know that if you decide to take action, you won't be alone. I have experience in these matters, and I can provide guidance to ensure success. Garrett had heard enough. Dr. Ash was actively recruiting him to commit murder, describing it as therapy, and offering to provide assistance based on his previous successes. The wire he was wearing had captured everything, providing evidence that would put Dr. Ash away for life. Doc, this is a lot to process. Can I have some time to think about it? Of course, but don't take too long, Mr. Matthews. Opportunities like this don't wait forever. And remember, everything we've discussed is protected by doctor-patient privilege. Garrett left Dr. Ash's office feeling sick to his stomach. The man was a predator who used his professional credentials to identify vulnerable people and manipulate them into committing murder for his own profit. How many other patients had he corrupted? How many other victims were buried in remote locations, their deaths attributed to accidents or disappearances? Agent Morrison was waiting in an unmarked van 3 blocks from the medical complex. How did it go? He confessed to everything, talked about Misty's murder like it was successful therapy, and he's actively planning another one. Did he identify the next target? No, but he mentioned another patient and showed me surveillance photos. This isn't over. He's got other operations in progress. They drove back to Taos in silence, both processing the implications of what they'd learned. Dr. Ash wasn't just a murderer. He was a serial killer who turned murder into a business model, using his psychiatric practice as a recruitment tool. We'll arrest him tonight, Morrison said as they reached the sheriff's office. Full tactical team, federal warrants, the works. He won't get a chance to warn his other accomplices or harm any more victims. But when the tactical team hit Dr. Ash's office and residence 3 hours later, they found both locations empty. Dr. Ash had disappeared, along with his patient files, his financial records, and any evidence of his other operations. A note left on his office desk was addressed to Sheriff Clayton Matthews. Sheriff, thank you for the interesting consultation. Your performance was quite convincing, though not quite convincing enough. I've been practicing this particular form of therapy for longer than you might imagine, and I've learned to recognize law enforcement techniques when I see them. By the time you read this, I'll be continuing my practice in a location where your jurisdiction doesn't extend. But don't worry, I'll be in touch when I have another patient who might benefit from your unique perspective on life and death. Garrett crushed the note in his hand, feeling rage and frustration course through him. Dr. Ash had escaped, taking with him the knowledge of how many other victims he'd created and how many other accomplices he might have recruited. Crystal Valdez would spend the rest of her life in prison for her role in Misty's murder. But the man who'd orchestrated the whole thing, who'd turned therapy into a tool for recruitment and murder into a business model, was still out there somewhere. and according to his note, he wasn't finished with Sheriff Garrett McAllister. 6 months later, Sheriff Garrett McAllister thought he'd put the Brennan case behind him. Crystal Valdez had been sentenced to life without parole. The FBI had taken over the investigation into Dr. Ash's network of murder-for-hire operations. And Garrett had gone back to the routine business of law enforcement in a small New Mexico county. Domestic disputes, drunk driving arrests, and the occasional cattle rustling case. He should have known it wouldn't be that simple. The first sign that Dr. Ash hadn't forgotten about him came on a Tuesday morning in early November. Garrett was reviewing incident reports when his secretary knocked on his door. "Sheriff, there's someone here to see you. Says it's about a missing hiker." The woman in the waiting area was maybe 40 years old, well-dressed, with the kind of nervous energy that came from serious worry. She introduced herself as Linda Harper, a nurse from Albuquerque whose daughter had disappeared while hiking in the Sangre de Cristo wilderness 3 days earlier. "My daughter Tiffany is an experienced hiker," Linda explained, her voice tight with strain. "She knows these mountains better than anyone, but she was supposed to be back Sunday night, and she's not answering her phone or responding to text messages." Garrett felt a familiar chill run down his spine. "Tell me about the hiking trip. Where was she going? Was she hiking alone?" "She was meeting someone, another hiker she'd been talking to online. Someone who claimed to know some remote trails that weren't crowded with tourists." "Did you meet this person? Do you know their name?" Linda shook her head. "That's what worries me. Tiffany was always careful about meeting strangers, but lately she's been going through some personal problems. Financial stress, relationship issues. She might not have been thinking clearly." The pattern was sickeningly familiar. A vulnerable young woman, financial problems, a mysterious hiking companion who knew remote wilderness areas. Garrett had seen this before, and it had ended with a body buried under a pile of rocks. "Mrs. Harper, I need you to tell me everything you know about your daughter's state of mind. Was she seeing a therapist? Anyone who might have been giving her advice about her problems?" Linda's face went pale. "How did you know?" "Yes, she started seeing a psychiatrist about 3 months ago. Dr. Vernon Ash. He comes very highly recommended, has an office in one of those expensive medical complexes." Garrett's blood turned to ice. Dr. Ash hadn't disappeared. He'd returned to Albuquerque and resumed his practice under his own name, apparently confident that law enforcement couldn't touch him without more evidence than they'd been able to gather. "Mrs. Harper, I need to ask you to do something that might sound strange, but it's very important. I need you to go home and wait for my call. Don't contact Dr. Ash, don't go to his office, don't do anything that might alert him to our conversation." "I don't understand. What does her psychiatrist have to do with Tiffany being missing?" "I can't explain right now, but I promise you we're going to find your daughter, and we're going to make sure the people responsible for her disappearance are held accountable." After Linda left, Garrett called Agent Morrison's direct number. Morrison had been promoted since the Brennan case, and was now running the FBI's domestic terrorism task force. But she told Garrett to contact her immediately if Dr. Ash resurfaced. "He's back," Garrett said when Morrison answered. "Same pattern, same methods. I think he's got another victim in the wilderness." "Are you sure it's him?" The missing woman was one of his patients. Financial problems, personal stress, mysterious hiking companion. It's the same playbook he used with Crystal and Misty. "We'll mobilize search teams immediately, but Garrett, you need to understand something. We've been tracking Dr. Ash for months. He's not working alone anymore. He's recruited at least 3 other accomplices, possibly more." "What kind of accomplices?" "Other psychiatric professionals who share his philosophy. They've formed what they call a therapeutic collective. They refer patients to each other, coordinate operations across multiple states, provide each other with alibis and support. The scope of what Morrison was describing was staggering. Dr. Ashe hadn't just resumed his individual practice. He'd expanded it into a network of professionals who used their positions to identify vulnerable people and manipulate them into committing murder. How many victims are we talking about? We've identified at least 12 suspicious deaths over the past 2 years. All wealthy individuals who died under unusual circumstances, all of whom had recently given large amounts of money to people who were being treated by members of this collective, and law enforcement hasn't been able to stop them. They're very careful. Each operation is structured to look like an isolated incident, a suicide, an accident, a personal dispute that got out of hand. It's only when you look at the pattern across multiple jurisdictions that you can see what's really happening. Garrett thought about Tiffany Harper, somewhere in the wilderness with people who viewed murder as a form of therapy. Morrison, we can't let this one end like the others. We have to find her before they kill her. Agreed, but we need to do this carefully. If we spook them too early, they'll disappear again and we'll never get another chance. The search for Tiffany Harper began at dawn the next day. But this time Garrett wasn't just looking for a missing hiker. He was hunting for a network of predators who used the wilderness as their killing ground. The FBI had been monitoring Dr. Ashe's communications, and they'd identified 2 other members of his collective who were likely involved in the current operation. Dr. Sandra Mills, a psychologist from Phoenix, and Dr. Wade Foster, a psychiatrist from Denver. All 3 had been in contact over the past week, using encrypted messaging systems to coordinate what they called another therapeutic intervention. The communication suggests they're using a different location this time, Morrison explained as they reviewed surveillance data. Not the Sangre de Cristo range, but somewhere in the Carson National Forest. That's a lot of territory to cover. Do we have any specific locations? We're working on it, but Garrett, there's something else you need to know. The communications mention you by name. Dr. Ashe views you as unfinished business. Garrett felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of unfinished business? He's planning to use this operation to eliminate you as a threat. The whole thing might be designed to lure you into a trap. Then we'll have to spring the trap carefully. The breakthrough came that afternoon when the FBI's technical team cracked Dr. Ashe's encryption and gained access to his real-time communications. The collective was using Tiffany Harper as bait, planning to draw Garrett into the wilderness where they could eliminate him along with their primary victim. But the communications also revealed the location where they were holding Tiffany, an abandoned hunting cabin in a remote section of the Carson National Forest, accessible only by a network of old logging roads. It's a perfect setup for an ambush, Morrison said as they studied satellite images of the area. Single-access road, clear fields of fire, multiple escape routes if things go wrong. How many people are we dealing with? At least 5. The 3 doctors plus 2 hired accomplices who specialize in wilderness operations. All armed, all experienced with this kind of terrain. Garrett looked at the maps, trying to identify tactical options. What about approaching from the back side? Through the forest instead of the road? Possible, but it would take hours to hike in and we'd be exposed the whole way. They probably have motion detectors and other surveillance equipment. Then we go direct, fast insertion, overwhelming force, get Tiffany out before they can harm her. The tactical operation began at sunset. FBI SWAT teams approached from multiple directions, while Garrett and Morrison coordinated from a mobile command post positioned 3 miles from the target location. Communication intercepts suggested that Tiffany was still alive, but Dr. Ashe was becoming impatient with what he called the sheriff's failure to take the bait. He's planning to accelerate the timeline, Morrison reported. If you don't show up alone within the next hour, they're going to kill her and disappear. Garrett made a decision that violated every principle of tactical safety. I'm going in. Absolutely not. We stick to the plan. The plan isn't working. They're not going to wait for us to get into position, and we can't risk Tiffany's life on a perfect tactical operation. Before Morrison could stop him, Garrett was out of the command post and heading for his patrol vehicle. He'd spent 6 months thinking about Dr. Ash, about the arrogance of a man who turned murder into therapy. Now it was time to end it. The drive to the hunting cabin took 20 minutes on roads that were barely more than dirt tracks through the forest. Garrett's radio crackled with increasingly frantic calls from Morrison, demanding that he abort the mission and wait for backup. He switched off the radio and continued driving. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by dense pine forest, exactly as the satellite images had shown. Garrett could see lights in the windows and at least 2 vehicles parked outside. Smoke was coming from the chimney, suggesting that Dr. Ash and his accomplices were settled in for a long stay. Garrett parked his patrol car at the edge of the clearing and got out with his hands visible. "Dr. Ash, I'm here. Let's finish our conversation." The cabin door opened and Dr. Ash stepped out, flanked by 2 men carrying rifles. Even at a distance, Garrett could see the psychiatrist's confident smile. "Sheriff McAllister, so good of you to accept our invitation. I was beginning to think you didn't care about Miss Harper's welfare. Where is she?" "Safe and sound for the moment, but her continued safety depends on your cooperation with a little experiment I've been planning." Dr. Ash gestured toward a chair that had been placed in the center of the clearing. "Please, have a seat. Remove your weapon first, of course." Garrett placed his service pistol on the ground and sat down, acutely aware that he was now completely exposed. "What kind of experiment?" "I'm curious about the psychological profile of law enforcement officers who interfere with therapeutic processes. Your behavior during our previous encounter suggested some interesting pathologies that I'd like to explore." "You mean your tendency to murder innocent people?" Dr. Ash laughed. "Murder is such a harsh word, Sheriff. I prefer to think of it as radical therapeutic intervention. Sometimes traditional methods simply aren't sufficient to resolve deep-seated psychological conflicts. Like Crystal's conflict about being broke. Crystal was suffering from severe depression brought on by financial stress and resentment toward more fortunate individuals. Traditional therapy would have taken years and might never have resolved her underlying issues. My approach provided immediate and permanent relief by turning her into a murderer, by empowering her to take control of her situation. The fact that Ms. Brennan died was an unfortunate but necessary consequence of Crystal's psychological healing." Garrett could hear vehicles approaching through the forest, Morrison and the tactical teams, finally reaching the target location. Dr. Ash heard them too, and his expression hardened. "It seems our conversation will have to be abbreviated, Sheriff, but don't worry. Miss Harper will be joining Miss Brennan shortly, and you'll be able to observe the therapeutic process firsthand." "You're not a doctor," Garrett said, standing up slowly. "You're just a predator who uses fancy words to justify murder. And you're just a small-town sheriff who doesn't understand the complexities of modern psychological treatment." Dr. Ash nodded to his accomplices, who raised their rifles. But before they could fire, the clearing erupted in gunfire as FBI tactical teams opened fire from concealed positions around the perimeter. Garrett threw himself behind his patrol car as bullets shattered the cabin windows. Dr. Ash was shouting orders to his accomplices, but the tactical teams had the advantage of numbers and positioning. Within minutes, 2 of the armed men were down, and the others were retreating into the cabin. Tiffany! Garrett shouted toward the cabin. Can you hear me? A muffled voice came from inside the building. I'm here, in the back room. Garrett sprinted toward the cabin as tactical teams laid down covering fire. He kicked in the back door and found Tiffany Harper tied to a chair in what had once been a bedroom. She was alive, but obviously terrified, with duct tape over her mouth and zip ties around her wrists. You're safe now, Garrett said, cutting her bonds. We're going to get you out of here. But as they prepared to leave the cabin, Dr. Ash appeared in the doorway with a pistol in his hand. Sheriff, I'm afraid I can't let you ruin another therapeutic intervention. The gunshot echoed through the forest, but it wasn't Dr. Ash who fired. Agent Morrison had positioned herself behind the psychiatrist, and her bullet found its target before he could pull his trigger. Dr. Vernon Ash died on the floor of a hunting cabin in the Carson National Forest, surrounded by evidence of the murder network he'd created and the lives he'd destroyed in the name of therapy. The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of his operations. 17 victims across 6 states, all wealthy individuals who'd been targeted by patients that Dr. Ash and his collective had manipulated into committing murder. The network had been operating for nearly 5 years, generating millions of dollars in profits while hiding behind the legitimacy of licensed medical practice. Crystal Valdez remained in prison, but her testimony helped convict 3 other members of the collective and led to the recovery of several additional victims' remains. Tiffany Harper recovered from her ordeal and went on to become an advocate for victims of psychological manipulation, speaking about the dangers of predators who use professional credentials to gain trust. And Sheriff Garrett McAllister went back to the routine business of law enforcement in a small New Mexico county, but he never again looked at missing person reports the same way. Because now he knew that sometimes the most dangerous predators were the ones who claimed to be healers, and that the wilderness could hide horrors far worse than anything nature could create. The mountains of New Mexico were beautiful and vast and unforgiving, but they were no match for the cruelty of human beings who had learned to use trust as a weapon and healing as a cover for murder. In the end, that was the most disturbing truth of all. Not that monsters existed, but that they could hide so effectively behind the very institutions that people trusted to protect them. Sheriff Wade Brennan had seen his share of missing persons cases over the past 18 years, but nothing quite like the Henderson family disappearance. They'd vanished from their campsite in the Cascade Wilderness 3 days ago, leaving behind everything except the clothes on their backs in a scene that made no sense at all. "Sheriff, you need to see this," Deputy Trent Collins called from the edge of the clearing where the Henderson family had pitched their tent. The tracks just stop. Wade made his way through the dense Douglas fir forest, his boots crunching on a carpet of fallen needles and moss. The morning fog was still thick at this elevation, maybe 4,000 feet above sea level, and visibility was limited to about 30 yards in any direction. The kind of conditions where you could walk in circles for hours without realizing it. The Henderson campsite sat in a small meadow beside Willow Creek, about 8 miles from the nearest trailhead. It should have been the perfect family camping spot. Water nearby, level ground for tents, and surrounded by the kind of pristine wilderness that brought people from all over the country to the Pacific Northwest. Instead, it looked like the opening scene of a horror movie. "Show me what you found," Wade said, pulling out his notebook. Trent led him to the eastern edge of the clearing, where the forest began in earnest. "Footprints here, clear as day. 4 sets, 2 adults, 2 kids. They match the shoe treads we found around the campsite." Wade knelt down to examine the prints in the soft earth. They were clear and deep, indicating the family had been walking at a normal pace, not running. The prints led directly into the forest, following what might have been an old game trail through the underbrush. How far did they go? That's the thing, Sheriff. About 50 yards that way, they'd just disappear, like the family walked into thin air. Wade followed Trent deeper into the forest, noting how the prints remained clear and consistent for about 40 yards. Then, gradually, they became fainter, more spaced out, until finally there was nothing at all. The soft forest floor should have held impressions for days, especially after the rain they'd had 2 nights ago. Could they have stepped on rocks, logs, something that wouldn't hold prints? I thought of that too. Trent pointed to the area where the tracks ended. But look around. It's all soft earth, fallen leaves, moss. Nothing hard enough to not show some kind of sign. Wade studied the terrain, looking for any explanation that would make sense. A creek they might have waded through. A rocky outcropping they could have climbed. A logging road they might have reached. But there was nothing except endless forest stretching in every direction. What about above? Could they have climbed trees? With 2 kids? The youngest is only 8 years old. And look at these trees. The lowest branches are 15, 20 feet up. No way they could have reached them. The Henderson family had been reported missing when they failed to check in with park rangers on Tuesday morning. Derek Henderson, 41, a software engineer from Seattle. His wife Crystal, 38, a nurse. Their 2 children, Amber, 14, and little Rex, 8, an experienced camping family who'd been visiting the Cascade Wilderness for years. Wade walked back to the campsite, trying to piece together what had happened. The family's tent was still standing, guy lines tight, rainfly properly secured. Inside, their sleeping bags were unzipped but neatly arranged, as if the family had gotten up normally on Monday morning. Their camp stove sat on a wooden picnic table, clean and cold. No signs of recent cooking. A cooler beside the table contained food that should have lasted them through Wednesday. Sandwiches, fruit, snacks, all untouched since Sunday night. Deputy Collins, walk me through what we know about their timeline. Trent consulted his notes. They arrived Saturday afternoon, set up camp, spent Saturday night here. Sunday they hiked to Eagle Lake and back, about 6 miles round trip. Park rangers saw them on the trail, said they seemed happy, everything normal. What about Sunday night? That's where it gets strange. Campfire ring shows they had a fire Sunday evening. Ashes are still warm underneath, so it burned for a while. But there's no sign they cooked dinner. No dirty dishes, no food scraps, nothing. Wade knelt beside the fire ring and stirred the ashes with a stick. Trent was right. Underneath the surface layer, the coals were still generating heat. A fire that had burned long and hot, probably until late Sunday night or early Monday morning. What did they burn? Just wood? Mostly, but look at this. Trent handed him a small piece of partially burned fabric. Found this in the ashes. Looks like it might be from clothing. Wade examined the fabric scrap. Cotton, blue in color, with what looked like part of a printed design. It could have been from a t-shirt or maybe a child's pajamas. Not necessarily sinister. People burned old clothes on camping trips all the time, but combined with everything else, it added to the growing list of things that didn't make sense. Any signs of struggle? Violence? That's the weird part. Everything looks completely normal except for the missing people. No torn fabric, no blood, no disturbed ground around the campsite. It's like they just decided to take a walk Monday morning and vanished. Wade spent the next hour going through the family's belongings. Derek Henderson's wallet was in his backpack, along with his car keys and cell phone. Crystal's purse contained her driver's license, credit cards, and over $300 in cash. The children's backpacks held the usual camping supplies: flashlights, water bottles, trail mix. Everything you'd leave behind if you were planning to take a short hike and come right back. "Sheriff, what do you think happened to them?" Trent asked as they finished documenting the scene. Wade looked around the peaceful clearing, trying to imagine what could have caused an entire family to walk into the wilderness and disappear without a trace. "I don't know, but I know this isn't a typical lost hiker situation." The search and rescue operation began that afternoon. Teams of volunteers combed the forest in expanding grids, following every game trail, checking every creek bed, investigating every possible route the Henderson family might have taken. Search dogs were brought in from the county sheriff's office, trained animals that could follow scent trails over difficult terrain. The dogs confirmed what Wade had suspected. The family's scent trail led from the campsite into the forest, following the same path as the footprints. But like the physical tracks, the scent trail simply stopped after about 50 yards, as if the family had evaporated. "In 20 years of search and rescue work," said Jake Morrison, the team coordinator, "I've never seen anything like this. People don't just disappear. There's always something. A torn piece of clothing, a dropped item, disturbed vegetation. Something. Could they have been picked up by someone? Another hiker, maybe someone with horses?" Morrison shook his head. "We would have found evidence of that. Horse tracks, boot prints from other people, some sign of a meeting. This trail is too narrow for vehicles, and there's no indication anyone else was in the area." As evening approached and the search teams returned to base camp, Wade found himself staring at a topographical map of the area, trying to understand what he was dealing with. The Henderson family had been experienced hikers, familiar with the wilderness, carrying proper equipment. They weren't the type to get lost or make stupid mistakes. Yet somehow, they'd walked into the forest on Monday morning and simply ceased to exist. "Sheriff," one of the search volunteers approached him, a local man named Vernon Pike, who'd been hiking these mountains for 30 years. "I wanted to mention something. Might not be important, but what is it? There's been other disappearances up here, over the years, I mean, people who went missing and were never found." Wade looked up from his map. "How many others?" "Hard to say exactly. Maybe 6 or 8 families over the past 15 years. Always the same pattern. Experienced hikers who knew what they were doing, good equipment, no reason to get in trouble. They just vanished." "Why didn't anyone connect them?" Vernon shrugged. "Different counties, different jurisdictions. People assumed they were isolated incidents. Accidents, maybe, or folks who decided to disappear on their own. But now, with this Henderson business, I'm starting to wonder." Wade made notes about the other disappearances, planning to research them when he got back to town. If Vernon was right, if there had been a pattern of families vanishing in the Cascade Wilderness, it changed everything about the investigation. "Mr. Pike, do you remember any specific details about the other missing families?" "Some. There was the Morrison family maybe 5 years ago. Parents and 3 kids vanished from a campsite about 10 miles north of here. Then the Taylor family, year before that, and before that." Vernon paused, thinking. "The Johnson family, that was maybe 8 years ago. Same thing every time. Campsite left intact, no signs of struggle, no trace of where they went." "Were any of the bodies ever found?" "Not that I know of. Search parties would look for a few days, then give up. Wilderness is just too big, too many places where someone could get lost and die. Eventually, people stopped talking about it." Wade folded up his map, his mind racing. If there had been multiple families disappearing over the years, all following the same pattern, it suggested something far more sinister than simple hiking accidents. It suggested someone or something was actively hunting families in the wilderness. That night, Wade couldn't sleep. He lay in his tent at the search base camp, listening to the sounds of the forest and thinking about the Henderson family. Where were they? Were they still alive? Were they lost somewhere in the wilderness waiting for rescue? Or had something happened to them that the search teams hadn't yet discovered? Around 2 a.m., he heard something that made him sit up in his sleeping bag. A sound that seemed out of place in the deep wilderness, the distant rumble of an engine. Not the steady drone of an airplane, but something closer to the ground. A truck, maybe, or some kind of heavy machinery. Wade unzipped his tent and stepped outside. The night was clear, with enough moonlight to see the shapes of trees and rocks around the base camp. He listened carefully, but the engine sound had stopped. The forest was quiet except for the usual nighttime sounds. Owls, small animals moving through the underbrush, the whisper of wind in the trees. He was about to go back into his tent when he heard it again. Definitely an engine, somewhere to the north of their position. It ran for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. Then, a few minutes later, it started up again, this time from a different direction. Wade grabbed his flashlight and radio. "This is Sheriff Brennan. Anyone else hearing engine sounds out there?" No response from any of the search team members. Either they were all asleep, or the sound wasn't carrying as far as he thought. He listened for another few minutes, but heard nothing more. The next morning, Wade asked the search team coordinators if anyone had reported vehicles in the area. No logging operations were scheduled, no maintenance work on the trails, no authorized vehicles anywhere near the wilderness area. Whatever he'd heard during the night, it wasn't supposed to be there. Could have been an airplane, Jake Morrison suggested. Sound carries funny in the mountains, especially at night. What seems close might actually be miles away. Maybe, but Wade had grown up in these mountains, had spent years learning how sound traveled through the forest. What he'd heard the night before had been close. Close enough that whoever was operating the vehicle would have seen the lights from their base camp. The search for the Henderson family continued for 6 more days. Helicopter overflights covered hundreds of square miles of wilderness. Ground teams followed every possible route the family might have taken. Technical rescue specialists rappelled into canyons and gorges where the family might have fallen. Nothing. No trace of Derek, Crystal, Amber, or Rex Henderson. No piece of clothing, no abandoned equipment. No indication they had ever existed beyond the campsite where they'd vanished. On the 7th day, the official search was called off. The Henderson family was added to the list of missing persons, their case file consigned to a stack of cold cases that grew larger every year. Their car remained in the parking lot at the trailhead, gathering dust and bird droppings, a lonely reminder of a family that had simply walked out of existence. But Wade wasn't ready to give up. The night before the search teams dispersed, he drove back to town and spent hours in the county records office, researching the other disappearances Vernon Pike had mentioned. What he found chilled him to the bone. The Morrison family disappeared June 15, 2019. Campsite found intact, no signs of struggle. Family vanished without trace. Search lasted 4 days before being called off. The Taylor family disappeared August 3, 2018. Same pattern. Experienced hikers, good equipment, perfect weather conditions. Vanished from their campsite, never seen again. The Johnson family disappeared September 12, 2016. Parents and 2 teenage children. Campsite undisturbed, family gone without explanation. Going back further, Wade found 3 more cases that fit the same pattern. Different counties, different search teams, but always the same result. Families disappearing from wilderness campsites, leaving behind all their possessions, vanishing so completely that no trace was ever found. 9 families, 36 people, all experienced hikers who knew the wilderness and weren't likely to make fatal mistakes. All disappeared under identical circumstances over a 15-year period. Wade spread out a map of the Cascade Range and marked the locations where each family had vanished. The pins formed a rough circle, maybe 40 miles in diameter, centered on some of the most remote wilderness in the Pacific Northwest. Area so isolated that you could hide almost anything and never be discovered. As he stared at the map, Wade realized he wasn't investigating a missing persons case anymore. He was looking at evidence of serial predation on a scale he'd never imagined possible. Someone was hunting families in the wilderness, and they'd been doing it for years. The question was, who and why? And most importantly, were the Henderson family and all the others still alive somewhere? Or had Wade spent the past week searching for people who were already dead? He was about to find out that some questions were better left unasked, and that the truth about the vanishing families was more terrifying than anything he could have imagined. But first, he had to survive long enough to uncover it. Sheriff Wade Brennan spent the next 3 weeks buried in case files, driving hundreds of miles to interview other law enforcement officers who'd investigated similar disappearances. What he discovered was a pattern so consistent it couldn't possibly be coincidence. Every missing family had been experienced hikers. Every campsite had been left perfectly intact. Every disappearance had occurred in remote wilderness areas during the late summer or early fall months. And in every case, the physical evidence, footprints, scent trails, any trace of the missing people simply stopped after a short distance into the forest. It's like they were picked up by something, Sheriff Dale Morrison of Coleman County told Wade during a phone interview. But there's never any sign of vehicles, aircraft, or other people in the area. What about the terrain? Could they have fallen into crevasses, been buried in landslides? We considered that. Ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, spelunking teams checking every cave and cliff face within miles of the disappearance sites. Nothing. These families didn't have accidents, Sheriff. Someone took them. Wade had come to the same conclusion, but hearing it confirmed by other investigators made the reality more disturbing. Someone with significant resources and planning was systematically hunting families in the wilderness. The operation was sophisticated enough to snatch entire families without leaving evidence, and it had been going on for over 15 years. But who would do such a thing? And what had happened to the victims? The answer came from an unexpected source. Wade was reviewing topographical maps in his office when Deputy Collins knocked on his door. "Sheriff, there's someone here to see you. Says he has information about the missing families." The man in Wade's waiting room was maybe 60 years old, weathered and lean in the way of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors. He wore faded jeans, work boots, and a flannel shirt that had seen better decades. His hands were scarred and calloused, and his eyes had the wary look of someone who'd seen things he'd rather forget. "I'm Marcus Sullivan," he said, shaking Wade's hand with a grip that could crack walnuts. "I've been hearing about your investigation into the disappearances. There's some things you need to know." Wade led Sullivan into his office and offered him coffee. "Mr. Sullivan, what kind of information do you have?" "The kind that might get me killed if the wrong people find out I talked to you." Sullivan's voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. "I used to work for the people who've been taking those families." Wade felt his pulse quicken. "What do you mean you used to work for them?" "I was a hunting guide. Legitimate business, or so I thought. Rich clients would pay me to take them into the wilderness for elk, deer, bear, premium hunts in areas where most people never go." Sullivan paused to sip his coffee, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. Problem was, some of those clients weren't hunting animals. What were they hunting? People. The word hung in the air between them like a poison cloud. Wade had suspected something terrible was behind the disappearances, but this was worse than anything he'd imagined. You're telling me there's some kind of organized group that hunts human beings? Not just any human beings, families, specifically families with children. Sullivan's voice was flat, emotionless, as if he'd rehearsed this conversation many times in his head. They call it the ultimate hunt. The idea is that hunting animals gets boring after a while. Where's the challenge in killing something that can't think, can't plan, can't truly understand what's happening to it? Wade felt sick. How many people are involved in this? Hard to say exactly. The operation is compartmentalized. Most people only know their small part of it. But I'd guess maybe 20 or 30 core members, with support staff bringing the total to maybe 50 people. Support staff? Guides like I was, transport specialists, communications people, medical personnel. Sullivan saw Wade's confused expression. They don't just kill the families immediately, Sheriff. That would be too easy. The whole point is the hunt, tracking, stalking, the thrill of pursuing prey that fights back. Wade grabbed his notebook and started writing. How does it work? The logistics of it. Families are identified months in advance. Urban professionals, usually, people with the money and experience to go wilderness camping. The hunters have people watching camping stores, outdoor gear websites, social media posts about planned hiking trips. They build profiles of potential targets, family composition, hiking experience, planned routes. How do they actually take the families? Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the mountains in the distance. Gas, some kind of aerosol compound that puts people to sleep almost instantly. They wait until the family is settled for the night, then flood the campsite with gas. By morning, the family wakes up somewhere else entirely. Where? Depends on which property they're using. The group owns several large tracts of private land throughout the Cascade Range. Thousands of acres of forest where they can conduct their hunts without interference. Wade thought about the engine sounds he'd heard during the search for the Henderson family. What kind of vehicles do they use? Military surplus, mostly. Modified trucks that can handle rough terrain, helicopters for quick insertion and extraction. Everything painted in camouflage patterns that make them nearly invisible from the air. Mr. Sullivan, why are you telling me this now? What made you decide to come forward? Sullivan set down his coffee cup and looked directly at Wade. Because I finally saw what they do to the families after the hunt is over. And because I found out my own daughter is on their target list. The story that emerged over the next 2 hours was one of the most disturbing things Wade had ever heard. Sullivan had worked as a guide for what he'd been told was an exclusive hunting club for nearly 10 years. He'd been paid extremely well to lead small groups of wealthy clients into remote areas of the wilderness, areas where they were unlikely to encounter other people. Initially, the hunts had been legitimate. Elk, black bear, the occasional mountain lion. But gradually, Sullivan began to notice odd things about his clients. They seemed less interested in the actual hunting than in discussing tactics, planning, strategy. They talked about moving targets and unpredictable prey in ways that didn't quite fit with hunting animals. I started asking questions about 3 years ago, Sullivan said. That's when they decided to bring me fully into the operation, show me what they were really doing. What did you see? A hunt in progress, the Morrison family. You probably have them in your files. Parents and 3 kids who disappeared from a campsite about 50 miles north of here. Wade consulted his notes. June 15th, 2019. We searched for them for a week. While you were searching the public lands, they were being hunted on private property about 20 miles away. I watched through binoculars as this family tried to survive in the forest, while 6 armed men tracked them down like animals. How long did it last? 4 days. The parents tried to protect their children, tried to find ways to escape, but they were in unfamiliar territory with no equipment and no idea where they were. The hunters had night vision, GPS, communication equipment, vehicles. The family had nothing except what they could scavenge from the forest. Wade felt rage building in his chest. What happened to them? What happens to all of them eventually? The hunters get bored with the chase, or the prey gets too weak to continue, and the hunt ends permanently. They kill them. Not immediately. First they... Sullivan stopped, his composure finally cracking. They do things to them, especially the children. The hunt isn't just about killing, it's about power, about having complete control over other human beings. They keep the families alive for days, sometimes weeks, until they've extracted every possible moment of entertainment from their suffering. Wade had to step outside his office for a few minutes to compose himself. In 28 years of law enforcement, he'd seen murder, rape, child abuse, every form of human evil imaginable. But this was something different. Systematic predation on an industrial scale, carried out by people with enough money and resources to operate with virtual impunity. When he returned, Sullivan was staring at a photograph on Wade's desk. Wade's own family at a camping trip last summer. "Nice family," Sullivan said quietly. "Your wife? Kids?" "Yes. Why?" "Because they fit the profile perfectly. Experienced outdoor family, good equipment, kids the right ages. If they're planning any wilderness camping trips, you need to stop them." Wade felt cold fear wash over him. "Are you saying my family is in danger?" "I'm saying your investigation has probably attracted their attention. They have people monitoring law enforcement communications, watching for any sign that someone is getting close to their operation. Once they identify you as a threat, they come after my family. It's how they operate. They don't go after law enforcement directly. Too much heat, too much attention. But families of investigators, that's different. That's just another hunt as far as they're concerned." Wade immediately called his wife Sarah and told her to take the kids to her mother's house in Portland. He couldn't explain the real reason over the phone, but Sarah heard something in his voice that convinced her not to argue. After she'd left town, Wade turned back to Sullivan. "I need specifics. Names, locations, dates. Everything you can tell me about this operation. I can give you some names, but most of these people use aliases. The leader calls himself the Colonel, former military, probably Special Forces. Real name might be Vernon something, but I was never sure." "What about the properties where they conduct the hunts?" Sullivan pulled out a hand-drawn map. 3 main locations that I know of. This one here is about 60 miles northeast of here, maybe 8,000 acres of forest. This one is farther north, near the Canadian border, and this one, he pointed to a spot on the map that made Wade's blood run cold. This one is only about 15 miles from where the Henderson family disappeared. Wade studied the map, noting the location Sullivan had marked. "Have you been to these properties?" "The first one, several times. It's set up like a military compound. Barracks, motor pool, communications center, even a medical facility. Everything you'd need to support extended operations in the wilderness." "How many people are based there?" "Maybe 15 or 20 full-time, but the number varies depending on whether there's a hunt in progress. During active hunts, the population might double." "What kind of security do they have?" "Professional grade. motion detectors, night vision cameras, armed patrols. These aren't weekend warriors playing soldier. They're ex-military contractors with serious training and equipment. Wade made detailed notes about everything Sullivan told him. But the more he learned, the more overwhelming the situation became. He was dealing with a well-funded, professionally organized criminal enterprise that had been operating for years without detection. Taking them down would require resources far beyond what his rural sheriff's department could provide. Mr. Sullivan, I'm going to need you to repeat all of this to federal authorities, the FBI, maybe ATF, or the U.S. Marshals. This is beyond local law enforcement. I've thought about that, but there's a problem. I'm not sure who can be trusted. What do you mean? This operation has been running for 15 years without being detected or stopped. That suggests they have protection from somewhere. Maybe just good operational security, or maybe they have people inside law enforcement agencies. It was a sobering thought, but one that made sense given the scale and sophistication of the operation Sullivan was describing. Do you have any evidence? Documents, photographs, anything that could corroborate what you're telling me? Sullivan reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. Some. Not enough to convict anyone, but enough to prove I'm telling the truth. Inside the envelope were photographs that made Wade's stomach turn. Images of families in forest settings, clearly terrified, being pursued by armed men. A map showing the locations of various hunting reserves. Financial records showing payments to guides, equipment purchases, even medical supplies. But it was the last document that made Wade's hands shake. A target list with names, addresses, and planned camping locations. The Henderson family was on the list, with a checkmark beside their names. And at the bottom of the list, added in different handwriting, was another entry that made Wade's blood freeze. Brennan family. Sheriff Wade Brennan, wife Sarah, children Misty, 12, Rex, 9. Planned camping trip, Eagle Lake area, July 15th to 17th. Wade stared at the document, his mind reeling. Not only had his family been targeted, but their planned camping trip for next month, a trip they'd been planning for months, was already known to the hunters. How did they get this information? They have people everywhere, camping stores, outdoor gear retailers, even Park Service employees. Anyone who has access to information about planned wilderness trips. Mr. Sullivan, we need to move fast. If they're planning to target more families... The Henderson family isn't dead yet, Sullivan interrupted. Neither are the others from this year's hunting season. They keep the families alive until the end of the season, then dispose of them all at once. When is the end of the season? October 31st, Halloween. They think it's funny. Wade looked at his calendar. It was currently September 18th. 6 weeks to save the Henderson family and whoever else was being held captive on the hunting preserves. 6 weeks to take down an organization that had been operating successfully for 15 years. And 6 weeks to keep his own family from becoming the next victims in a game that had already claimed at least 36 lives. As Sullivan gathered his papers and prepared to leave, Wade made a decision that would change everything. I need you to take me to one of their properties. Show me exactly what we're dealing with. Sullivan stared at him. Sheriff, that's suicide. Even if we could get close enough to see anything useful, they'd detect us long before we could get back out. These people don't take prisoners. They eliminate threats. Then we'll have to be very, very careful. When? Tonight. Under cover of darkness, minimum equipment, in and out before they know we're there. Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, weighing the risks against the potential benefits. Finally, he nodded. I know a way in. But Sheriff, if we're caught, we won't just be arrested. will become part of their next hunt. Wade thought about the Henderson family, about the 36 people who'd vanished over the years, about his own children sleeping safely at his mother-in-law's house in Portland. Then we better not get caught. As the sun set over the Cascade Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Wade Brennan prepared for the most dangerous night of his career. He was about to infiltrate a compound where human beings were bought and sold like livestock, where families were hunted for sport, where discovery meant death. But he was also about to uncover evidence that would finally bring justice for the victims of the most horrific criminal enterprise he'd ever encountered, if he lived long enough to use it. The compound was worse than Wade had imagined. He and Marcus Sullivan lay prone on a ridge overlooking the facility, watching through night vision binoculars as armed guards patrolled a perimeter that enclosed maybe 100 acres of forest. Below them, concealed among the trees, were structures that looked more like a military installation than any kind of hunting lodge. "That's the main barracks," Sullivan whispered, pointing to a large building near the center of the compound. "Houses maybe 20 people. The building next to it is communications and command. That smaller structure there is medical." Wade adjusted his binoculars to get a better look at the medical facility. What do they need medical for? Patching up the hunters when things get out of hand, and keeping the prey alive longer than they would naturally survive. Through his night vision, Wade could see vehicles parked in neat rows, military-style trucks, ATVs, even what looked like armored personnel carriers. Everything was painted in forest camouflage patterns that would make them nearly invisible during daylight operations. How many guards? Usually 6 on patrol at any given time, plus whoever's in the command center monitoring the perimeter sensors. During an active hunt, the number doubles. Is there a hunt happening now? Sullivan pointed to an area beyond the main compound, where Wade could see lights moving through the forest. Started 2 days ago, the Henderson family, plus 2 others they picked up last week. Wade felt his stomach clench. 3 families? The Dalton family from Oregon and the Price family from Northern California. Both experienced hikers, both disappeared from campsites without a trace. Same pattern as always. Through his binoculars, Wade could see the lights moving in what appeared to be a coordinated search pattern. The hunters were spread out in a line, methodically combing through the forest, driving their prey deeper into the wilderness. Where are the families now? Hard to say exactly. Could be anywhere within a 10-mile radius of the compound. The hunters like to give them a head start, let them think they might escape. Makes the eventual capture more satisfying. Wade watched the lights for several minutes, trying to understand the logistics of what he was seeing. How do they prevent the families from reaching roads, other campers, park rangers? The hunting preserve is completely surrounded by private land owned by shell companies controlled by the group. Anyone who strays onto the property can be legally detained as trespassers, and the hunters have communication equipment that lets them coordinate with each other in real time. What about aircraft? Emergency helicopters? The preserve is designated as a no-fly zone due to sensitive wildlife research. Any aircraft that enters the airspace is intercepted by security personnel and turned away. Wade was beginning to understand the scope of what he was dealing with. This wasn't just a criminal organization. It was a sophisticated paramilitary operation with legitimate cover stories, legal protections, and resources that rivaled those of law enforcement agencies. Sullivan, how do we get close enough to gather evidence without being detected? We don't. The perimeter sensors will pick up any movement within half a mile of the compound. Even if we could get inside somehow, the place is crawling with armed guards who shoot first and ask questions later. Wade studied the compound through his binoculars. looking for any weakness in their security. The guards followed predictable patrol routes. There were blind spots between some of the buildings, and the medical facility was positioned at the edge of the compound where it might be accessible from the forest. What if we create a distraction? Something to draw the guards away from the perimeter. Like what? Fire. A small brush fire on the opposite side of the compound from where we want to infiltrate. Nothing big enough to threaten the main buildings, but significant enough that they'd have to respond. Sullivan considered this. Might work, but it would only give us a few minutes before they realized what was happening and locked down the entire area. A few minutes might be enough to get into the medical facility and gather evidence. Photographs, documents, maybe even rescue any survivors who might be held there. Sheriff, you're talking about a suicide mission. Even if we could get inside, how would we get back out? The entire area will be swarming with armed men looking for intruders. Wade lowered his binoculars and looked at Sullivan. Do you have a better idea? Sullivan was quiet for several minutes, weighing options that all seemed to end in death or capture. Finally, he sighed and reached into his backpack. There is one possibility, but it's even more dangerous than your fire idea. He pulled out what looked like a small electronic device, about the size of a cell phone. GPS tracker with emergency beacon. If I can get close enough to one of the hunting parties, I can plant this on them. It will transmit their location in real time, letting us track the hunt in progress. What good does that do us? Because at some point during the hunt, the families are going to be recaptured and brought back to the compound for the final phase. When that happens, we'll know exactly where they are and when they're most vulnerable. The final phase. Sullivan's expression was grim. Public execution. The hunters gather to watch as the families are killed, usually in elaborate ways designed to maximize suffering. It's the climax of the entire operation. Wade felt sick thinking about what the Henderson family and the others were going through, knowing that their ordeal would end in ritualized murder unless he could find a way to stop it. How long do the hunts usually last? Varies. Depends on how much sport the families provide, how long they can survive in the wilderness. This hunt started 2 days ago, so they probably have another 3 or 4 days before the final phase. Then, that's our timeline. We have 4 days to gather evidence, contact federal authorities, and organize a rescue operation. Sheriff, you don't understand. Even if we could prove what's happening here, even if we could get FBI or military support, this organization has connections everywhere. They'll know we're coming before we ever get close. Wade thought about the document Sullivan had shown him, with his own family's name on the target list. Then we'll have to be smarter than they are. They spent the next hour observing the compound, documenting guard patterns, vehicle, movements, and the location of key buildings. Wade took hundreds of photographs with a camera equipped with a telephoto lens, building a comprehensive intelligence picture of the facility. Around 3 a.m., they heard the sound of engines starting up. Through their binoculars, they watched as several vehicles left the compound and headed into the forest, presumably to support the hunting parties tracking the 3 families. "This is our chance," Wade whispered. "Reduced security, most of their people committed to the hunt. Chance for what? To get inside the compound and gather evidence, physical proof that we can use to bring federal authorities into this." Sullivan stared at him. "You're serious about this?" "Dead serious. 3 families are going to die in the next few days if we don't act. How many more after that? How long before my own family ends up on their hunting preserve?" Sullivan checked his watch, then looked back at the compound. The guard patrols had been reduced, and there were long periods when entire sections of the perimeter were unwatched. If we're going to do this, It has to be now, while they're distracted by the hunt. But Sheriff, I want you to understand something. If we're caught, we won't just be killed. We'll be added to the hunt. They'll turn us loose in the forest and track us down for sport. Then we won't get caught. They made their way down from the ridge, moving carefully through the forest toward the compound's perimeter. The night was cold and clear, with enough moonlight to navigate without flashlights, but dark enough that they could avoid the security cameras mounted on trees around the facility. Wade had brought a small digital camera, lockpicks, and basic surveillance equipment. His plan was simple: get inside one of the buildings, photograph whatever evidence he could find, and get back out before anyone noticed they'd been there. The medical facility turned out to be their best option. It was positioned at the edge of the compound, partially concealed by trees, and the nearest guard patrol was over 100 yards away. More importantly, the building's windows weren't barred, and the door appeared to be secured with a standard commercial lock, rather than the military-grade security protecting other parts of the facility. "I'll pick the lock," Wade whispered. "You watch for guards." The lock was trickier than he'd expected, but his hands were steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. After several tense minutes, he heard the satisfying click of tumblers falling into place. The interior of the medical facility was worse than anything Wade had seen in 28 years of law enforcement. The main room contained standard medical equipment, examination tables, IV stands, surgical instruments. But the walls were lined with photographs that documented the systematic torture and murder of dozens of people. Men, women, and children in various stages of injury and terror. Some appeared to have been taken during the hunts, showing families being tracked through the forest like animals. Others were clearly taken in this very room, showing victims being subjected to medical procedures that seemed designed to prolong suffering rather than provide treatment. Wade photographed everything, his hands shaking with rage as he documented evidence of crimes that went far beyond even his worst expectations. In a filing cabinet, he found medical records detailing procedures performed on hunt victims, operations designed to keep them alive longer, to make them more challenging prey, to maximize the entertainment value of their suffering. But it was the computer on the desk that provided the most damning evidence. Wade managed to access files that contained detailed records of every hunt conducted over the past 15 years. Names of victims, dates of capture, duration of hunts, methods of execution. A complete database of murder stretching back to the organization's founding. The Henderson family was listed in the active files, along with the Dalton and Price families. All three were scheduled for final processing on October 1st, just 5 days away. But there was another file that made Wade's blood freeze. A list of targets for the next hunting season, with detailed profiles of 20 different families. His own family was near the top of the list, with a note indicating that they were considered high priority due to his investigation into the disappearances. Wade photographed the computer files, the wall photographs, and the medical records, building a comprehensive documentation of the organization's crimes. But as he prepared to leave, he heard something that made his heart stop. The sound of vehicles returning to the compound. Through the window, he could see headlights approaching the main gate. The hunting parties were coming back, probably to resupply or report on their progress. "Sullivan," he whispered into his radio. "We need to get out of here, now." "Can't. Guard patrol just passed my position. If I move, they'll see me." Wade looked around the medical facility, searching for anything else that might be useful as evidence. That's when he noticed something that nearly made him sick. A storage room at the back of the building with a heavy steel door that was slightly ajar. Inside the storage room were personal belongings from the hunt victims. Clothing, jewelry, family photographs, children's toys. dozens of items from dozens of families, all carefully cataloged and preserved like trophies. But mixed in with the personal belongings were items that suggested some of the victims might still be alive. Fresh clothing in children's sizes, medical supplies that appeared to have been used recently, food containers with current expiration dates. Wade photographed everything, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely operate the camera. The evidence he was documenting represented the systematic murder of dozens of people, including children. But it also suggested that some victims might be held captive for extended periods before being killed, which meant there might be survivors somewhere on the hunting preserve. People who could be rescued if he could find them in time. The sound of voices outside the building made him freeze. Guards were approaching, probably conducting a routine security check. Wade turned off his camera and looked for a place to hide, but the medical facility was too small and open to offer any real concealment. He was about to be discovered in a room full of evidence that would get him killed, with no way to escape and no backup coming to rescue him. The investigation that was supposed to save the Henderson family was about to end with his own death. But then he heard a sound that changed everything. A gunshot, followed by shouts and the sound of men running. Something had happened elsewhere in the compound, something that had diverted the guards' attention away from the medical facility. Wade didn't wait to find out what it was. He slipped out of the building and ran for the tree line, his heart pounding as he made his way back toward the ridge where he'd left his vehicle. Behind him, the compound erupted into chaos. Searchlights swept the forest. Guards shouted orders, and the sound of engines filled the night as vehicles rushed towards some kind of emergency. Wade didn't stop running until he reached his truck, where he found Sullivan waiting with blood on his shirt and a grim expression on his face. What happened back there? One of the hunting parties found something they weren't supposed to find, Sullivan said, starting the engine. A ranger patrol that wandered too close to the preserve boundary. They had to eliminate the threat. As they drove away from the compound, Wade realized that the situation was even worse than he'd thought. The organization wasn't just hunting families for sport. They were eliminating anyone who got too close to their operation, including law enforcement personnel, which meant that Wade's investigation had just painted a target on the back of every ranger, deputy, and federal agent in the region. The hunters weren't just going to defend their preserve, they were going to go on the offensive to protect their operation. And Wade was about to find out just how far they were willing to go to keep their deadly secret. The federal agents who arrived the next morning weren't at all what Wade had expected. Instead of FBI or ATF personnel, he found himself facing two men in expensive suits who introduced themselves as representatives of the Department of Homeland Security. They examined his evidence with professional interest, but seemed more concerned about containing the situation than pursuing justice. "Sheriff Brennan, we appreciate the intelligence you've gathered," said Agent Dale Morrison, the older of the two men. "But I need you to understand that this situation involves national security issues that are beyond local law enforcement jurisdiction." Wade spread the photographs across his desk. Images of torture victims, murdered families, the personal belongings of dozens of people who'd been hunted like animals. These people are U.S. citizens who were murdered by an organized criminal enterprise. How is this a national security issue? The second agent, who'd introduced himself only as Agent Price, answered without looking up from the documents. "Because some of the individuals involved in this operation have connections to foreign intelligence services. Shutting down their activities requires careful coordination with multiple federal agencies. While you're coordinating, more families are going to die. The Henderson family and two others are scheduled for execution in 3 days." Agent Morrison closed the file containing Wade's photographs. "Sheriff, I need you to cease all investigative activities related to this case immediately. Any further interference could compromise an ongoing federal operation." Wade stared at them. "Are you telling me there's already a federal investigation into this hunting operation? I'm telling you to stay away from the compound you infiltrated last night, for your own safety and the safety of your family." The implied threat was clear. Wade's investigation had attracted the attention of people who could make him and his family disappear just as easily as they'd eliminated the missing hikers. He was being told to back off or face the consequences. But Wade had seen the evidence. He'd documented crimes that demanded justice, regardless of who was trying to cover them up or why. 3 families were going to be murdered in 3 days, and he was the only person in a position to prevent it. After the federal agents left, Wade called Marcus Sullivan and arranged to meet at a diner outside of town. Sullivan arrived looking haggard and nervous, constantly checking over his shoulder as if expecting to be followed. "They got to you too, didn't they?" Sullivan said, sliding into the booth across from Wade. 2 agents claiming to be from Homeland Security. They basically told me to forget everything I'd seen and stop investigating. Which means we're getting close to something they can't afford to have exposed. Wade ordered coffee and tried to process what was happening. "Sullivan, is it possible this hunting operation is some kind of government program? Black Ops, classified research, something like that? I've wondered about that myself. The level of resources, the sophisticated equipment, the apparent immunity from law enforcement, it all suggests government involvement. But why? What would be the purpose of hunting American families?" Sullivan was quiet for several minutes, stirring sugar into his coffee and staring out the window at the parking lot. Finally, he spoke in a voice so low Wade had to lean forward to hear him. "What if it's not about hunting? What if the families aren't being killed for sport?" "What do you mean? What if they're being taken for some other purpose? Medical experimentation, psychological research, biological weapons testing. The hunting aspect might just be cover for something else entirely." Wade thought about the medical facility he'd infiltrated, the sophisticated equipment, the records of procedures performed on victims. "The medical records I photographed showed operations designed to keep people alive under extreme stress. Not torture for entertainment, clinical procedures with specific medical objectives." "Exactly. What if this whole operation is a research program studying human survival responses, pain tolerance, psychological breakdown under extreme stress?" The implications were staggering. If Sullivan was right, the missing families hadn't just been murdered. They'd been used as test subjects in some kind of classified human experimentation program. How do we prove it? We don't. People involved in programs like that don't leave evidence lying around, and anyone who gets too close has a tendency to disappear. Wade looked around the diner, noting the other customers, the exits, the line of sight from the parking lot. For the first time in his career, he felt genuinely afraid, not just for himself, but for his family, his deputies, anyone who might be caught up in whatever he'd stumbled into. "Sullivan, I need to ask you something. When you worked for these people, did you ever see any evidence of government involvement? Military personnel, federal agents, anything that suggested official sanction?" "Not directly, but there were things that didn't add up. Equipment that should have been impossible for civilians to acquire. Communications gear that seemed to be tied into official networks. And the operational security was too good. Like they had access to real-time intelligence about law enforcement activities." "What about the clients? The people paying for these hunts?" "That's where it gets interesting. Most of them weren't typical wealthy hunters looking for thrills. They were professionals, doctors, researchers, people who seemed more interested in studying the victims than killing them. Wade felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. What if the hunting operation is cover for human experimentation? The clients aren't paying for entertainment. They're paying to study human subjects under extreme conditions. Medical researchers, pharmaceutical companies, defense contractors, anyone who needs data about human survival responses but can't get approval for legitimate clinical trials. The conversation was interrupted by Wade's radio crackling to life. "Sheriff Brennan, we have a situation at the Morrison compound. Multiple casualties need you on scene immediately." Wade felt his blood turn cold. The Morrison compound was the abandoned mine where he'd planned to set up a surveillance post to monitor the hunting preserve. If there were casualties there, it meant the hunters had found his backup plan. "I have to go," Wade told Sullivan. "Whatever's happening, it's connected to our investigation." The drive to the Morrison compound took 30 minutes through winding mountain roads. Wade's mind raced as he considered possibilities. Had one of his deputies stumbled onto the hunting operation? Had federal agents moved against the preserve without telling him? Or had the hunters decided to eliminate potential threats before anyone else could interfere with their operation? The scene at the Morrison compound was carnage. 3 vehicles were scattered around the abandoned mine buildings, all showing signs of having been attacked by heavy weapons. Wade counted 6 bodies, all armed men in tactical gear who'd apparently been killed in a coordinated assault. Deputy Collins met him at the perimeter, his face pale with shock. "Sheriff, this is unlike anything I've ever seen. Looks like military action, precision shooting, coordinated movement, professional execution." Wade examined the bodies and vehicles, noting the sophisticated equipment the dead men had been carrying. Night vision gear, encrypted communications, weapons that weren't available to civilians. These weren't local criminals or hunters. They were professional operators who'd been eliminated by people with even better training and equipment. Any identification on the bodies? Nothing. No wallets, no ID, no dog tags. But Sheriff, look at this. Collins led him to one of the vehicles, where he'd found something that made Wade's stomach drop. Photographs. Surveillance photos of Wade's house, his family, his office. Maps showing his daily routes, his home address, the school his children attended. These men had been preparing to target Wade's family, just as the document in the medical facility had suggested. "They were coming after us," Wade said quietly. "Looks like it, but someone stopped them first." Wade studied the scene more carefully, trying to understand what had happened. The attack had been swift and professional, the kind of operation that required extensive planning and superior firepower. But who had carried it out? The answer came from an unexpected source. As Wade was photographing the scene, he found a note pinned to one of the bodies. "Sheriff, some problems solve themselves, but others require more direct intervention. Your investigation ends here. Take your family and leave the county. You have 24 hours, no signature, no identifying marks. But the message was clear. Someone had eliminated the immediate threat to Wade's family, but the underlying problem remained. The hunting operation was still active. The missing families were still going to be executed. And Wade was being told to abandon his investigation or face consequences that wouldn't be solved by mysterious benefactors. Wade spent the rest of the day processing the crime scene and trying to understand who might have intervened on his behalf. Federal agents with their own agenda, military personnel conducting a classified operation, or another faction within the hunting organization itself. But as evening approached, he realized that the identity of his protectors mattered less than the choice he now faced. He could take his family and flee, abandoning the Henderson family and the others to their fate. Or he could continue his investigation, knowing that doing so would put everyone he cared about at risk. The decision was made for him when Deputy Collins received a call from the state police. "Sheriff, they found something at Eagle Lake. You need to see this." Eagle Lake was where the Henderson family had been camping when they disappeared. Wade had been there dozens of times during the search, but apparently something had been overlooked. What they found changed everything. Hidden in a cave system near the lake were the personal belongings of not just the Henderson family, but items from at least a dozen other missing families. Clothing, camping equipment, children's toys, all carefully preserved and cataloged. But more importantly, they found evidence that some of the missing people might still be alive. Fresh food containers, recent medical supplies, clothing in children's sizes that appeared to have been worn recently. "Sheriff," Collins said, examining a child's jacket that was damp with morning dew. "This was outside overnight. Someone was wearing it very recently." Wade studied the cave system, noting that it extended deep into the mountainside. The cave could provide shelter for people hiding from hunters, but it could also serve as a holding area for victims being kept alive for extended periods. "We need search and rescue teams down here. Full cave exploration, emergency medical personnel, everything we can mobilize." "What about the federal agents? They told you to stop investigating." Wade looked at the evidence spread around the cave entrance. Proof that families were being held captive somewhere in the wilderness, possibly within rescue distance if they acted quickly enough. The federal agents can go to hell. There are children out there who need our help. The cave rescue operation began at sunrise. Specialized teams with climbing equipment and underground communications gear worked their way through a network of tunnels that extended for miles beneath the Cascade Mountains. What they found in the deepest chambers was both horrifying and hopeful. Signs of recent habitation, food wrappers, makeshift bedding, evidence that people had been living in the caves for extended periods, but also signs of organized resistance, weapons improvised from cave formations, defensive positions, evidence that the missing families had been fighting back against their captors. And then, in a chamber nearly half a mile underground, they found them. 7 people from 3 different families, including Derek and Crystal Henderson and their 2 children. Alive, but barely. They'd been surviving on minimal food and water, hiding in the cave system to avoid the hunters who'd been tracking them through the wilderness. The rescue was difficult and dangerous, requiring hours of careful work to evacuate injured and traumatized people through narrow cave passages. But when the last survivor reached the surface, Wade felt something he hadn't experienced since the investigation began: hope that justice might still be possible. The survivor's testimony provided the missing pieces of the puzzle. The hunting operation was indeed connected to medical research, but the clients weren't paying for entertainment. They were paying for data about human survival responses under extreme conditions. The families were kept alive for extended periods, subjected to various forms of stress and deprivation, while researchers documented their physical and psychological responses. The hunting aspect was just one of several scenarios designed to generate useful research data. But the survivors had also learned something else during their captivity: the location of the main research facility where other victims were being held. An underground complex beneath the hunting preserve where human experimentation had been conducted for years. Wade organized a multi-agency assault on the facility, bringing together federal agents, military personnel, and local law enforcement in the largest operation in the county's history. What they found beneath the hunting preserve was a horror that would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. Dozens of victims, some held captive for years, subjected to medical procedures that defied every ethical standard. Research data documenting thousands of experiments on unwilling human subjects. financial records showing payments from pharmaceutical companies, defense contractors, and government agencies. The arrests that followed reached into the highest levels of corporate and government leadership. The hunting operation had been cover for a massive human experimentation program that had operated with official sanction for nearly 2 decades. But even as justice was finally served, Wade couldn't shake the feeling that he'd only uncovered part of the truth. The mysterious intervention that had saved his family, the federal agents who'd tried to shut down his investigation, the sophisticated resources that had allowed the operation to function for so long, all suggested connections that extended far beyond what had been exposed. 6 months later, Wade was still sheriff of his county, but he'd learned to be much more careful about which cases he chose to investigate thoroughly. His family was safe, the immediate threat had been eliminated, and some measure of justice had been achieved. But late at night, when he couldn't sleep, Wade would sometimes think about the other cases that crossed his desk. Missing persons reports that might conceal larger conspiracies, accidents that might not be accidental, people who disappeared into the wilderness and were never found. How many other operations were still out there, hidden in the vast wilderness of the Pacific Northwest? How many other families were being hunted, captured, and used for purposes that legitimate science would never sanction? Wade didn't know, and part of him didn't want to know, because he'd learned that some truths were too dangerous to uncover, and that the people who protected those secrets were willing to go to extraordinary lengths to keep them hidden. The Henderson family had been saved, justice had been partially served, and Wade's own family was safe. Sometimes, in a world full of monsters hiding behind respectable facades, that was the best outcome you could hope for. Even when you knew that somewhere in the darkness, other families were still being hunted, and other sheriffs were still trying to solve cases that were far more dangerous than they appeared.